Good morning. We welcome you to the Wednesday, July the 17th meeting of the Board of Trustees for the Utah Transit Authority. We'd like to begin and invite you to stand and joining us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll begin, as we do all of our meetings, with our Safety First Minute and Sheldon Shaw. Good morning, Sheldon.
Good morning, Chair, Trustees. As always, I appreciate the opportunity. Sheldon Shaw, Acting Safety and Security Manager. My safety message for today is it's hot. It's 95 degrees today, supposed to be pushing 100 for almost the next 2 weeks. And so we have a lot of employees who have most of their shift outside. And so staying hydrated is important, giving them a chance to have a break indoors and get out of the sun when we can make that happen. And so stay hydrated is my safety message.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next up is our public comment. Bob, do we have some comment?
We do not have any public comment today.
Okay. All right, thank you. First item of action up is our approval of our July 10th board meeting minutes.
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we approve the minutes from July 10th.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion passes. Next item up is our agency report with Steve Meyer.
Good morning, Chair. First off, I'd like to have Jeff Lamora come up with his team and talk about our recent experience at the International Rail Rodeo.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jeff.
Is this on? Okay. Thanks, Steve. Trustees, thank you. Thank you for letting us be here today. It's a happy day. We want to recognize our International Rail Rodeo team for their great competition a few weeks ago. So I have a little written explanation of what it is and a little bit about what they did and who they are as I introduce them.
That'd be great.
So the APTA International Rail Rodeo took place June 20th to the 22nd in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. The competition included an operator competition and a maintainer competition, as well as a combined team competition. This year's Rail Rodeo consisted of 19 teams from around the United States, Canada, and Japan. All competitors qualified by winning a local rodeo, which our local rodeo was led by Brian Sawyer here, and organized by Brian Sawyer with a number of other volunteers that were part of that. And that was held in April of this year at Midvale. All competitors for the local rodeo and international rodeo have to meet very strict APTA requirements, including excellent attendance, no discipline, and they can't do any practicing on UTA's time. They have to do any practicing, any preparation on their own time. Certainly the intent of the rodeo is to recognize and build exceptional skill among employees, building teamwork, and building and improving relationships both inside and outside of UTA. The operator competition is a competitive test and measure of an operator team's professional skills, knowledge of safety regulations, train equipment, and wayside rules and procedures. This year's operator team consisted of 2 people, first-timer Michelle Smith, and fifth time competing.
Who's counting?
Logan Packer. So the 2 of them, they competed by, there's a written safety test, there's a train inspection, an operator course, and a customer service module. Our maintainer team here, the maintainer competition is a competitive test of maintainer skills and abilities. All of the events related in the competition relate to car vehicle maintenance. The maintainers competition consists of 13 individual events that include a written test, electrical coupler, head, dexterity plate, wheel gauge, application, doors, gearbox, mechanical measuring, and a few others. So this year's this year's UTA maintainer team was comprised of 3 members: Roman Dobre, Jody Fairborn, and Tyler Hardy. We also had 2 coaches. The operator team had a coach, Jacqueline Smith Nelson, who couldn't be here, and the maintainer team had a coach that was Sharon Jeet Siney, who is on vacation this week and couldn't be here. So to get to the good part, which is the conclusion here. So the summary of the awards that these guys earned this year. UTA finished 6th out of 13 or of 19 teams overall, so top 3rd this year. So they did a great job there. The maintainer team won the mechanical measuring competition. So great job, guys. And the operator team won the operating course, finished 1st place in the operating course, which is no small feat because you're operating somebody else's equipment on somebody else's signals and track and environment that you've never operated on before. So they did a phenomenal job there. And then last but not least, the operator team finished 1st overall in the operator competition. So they did a fantastic job, represented UTA really, really well inside the competition and outside the competition while in Toronto, and we certainly appreciate your support for allowing us to go compete.
If it's appropriate, can we stand and give them
Absolutely.
We can and should.
Yeah. Well, way to go and beat them on their home court. So that's wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you each for all the great work that you do every day. Our customers are very lucky to have you both behind and in front of the scenes. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're worried they may set up a different classification and put us in the top tier and make it even more challenging. But it is a great competition, and you are, you're competing against the best in the transit industry from around the country. So really shows well for UTA.
Very proud.
The other item I want to talk about is yesterday we had a media release and discussed our naming of the transit app as our endorsed trip planning app. It's exciting. I've been using and touting that app myself for quite a while and really find that it provides a lot of good information to help plan your trips on transit, multi-modes. It has links to the bike share and Uber and Lyft, so it talks about multiple modes, and it's a very convenient tool for our riders to use as they plan their travel on UTA and these other modes. So we're excited to be a partner with transit.
So if they're in transit and they find a route, though, they have to actually go to the Go Ride to purchase the.
That's correct.
Ride.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the 2 items I had today.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Great, encouraging news. We'll next go to our quarterly investment report with Bob Biles. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning. So we'll look at the second quarter investment report today. This will look very familiar on the top section because we haven't bought or sold any of those investments. So we have about almost $40 million of investments that UTA's made. When we made these, were about 5-year investments. And so we've just been holding those. Those were a good rate at the time, but rates have gone up since then. And so we're looking for opportunities as rates decline, as we ride the yield curve down, to offload these and move into higher investments. But at the time, they were good. The next section is investments that are held by others, such as Zion Capital Advisors. They do our 1 to 3 year investments. Zion Bank, that's really overnight money that gets swept into this account. And then, of course, the Public Treasurer's Investment Fund that's managed by the State Treasurer. And so we've got, subtract those out. Never do math in public, I know, but $153 million approximately there. And then the bottom section is our test of are we meeting our thresholds on the benchmark. The benchmark return for each of those months were 244, 239, and then 238. Zion's Capital Investors and the PTIF exceeded those, and the Zion's Bank was very close. That's the quarterly investment report.
Is the Zion's Bank portion, is that, I assume it's fairly liquidable because it's just overnight sweeps,
Yeah,
right?
it's overnight sweep account.
Okay. Well, I'm always impressed that the PTAF does so well, you know, in comparison to the rest.
Certainly, and they've got a 270-day maximum. They're in corporates, very heavy into corporates, and so that's part of the reason they're getting the excess return over a 3-month T-bill.
Okay. Great. Any questions for Bob? Thanks for the update there, Bob. Thank you. First item up for business is a resolution authorizing the execution of Addendum 2 to the Salt Lake City Transit Master Plan Interlocal Agreement for 2019-20, the frequent transit network routes. And I have Nicole Bardot and Laura Hansen with us, and I think we always anticipated you coming back as their budget year commenced. And
So, thank you. Last night I attended the formal meeting for Salt Lake City Council, and it was very ceremonial as they adopted the resolution for this addendum. And I will tell you, they all fought over who got to first and second the resolution to adopt this. So it was very exciting and pretty emotional at Salt Lake City. So they wanted to thank you all and thank our staff, our ops planners, planning, and everyone that's worked on this because it's been quite a thing for them, and they really appreciate all the hard work everyone's done at UTA. So as you said, we're here to present the resolution for the Salt Lake City Addendum 2. This addendum outlines the August or the 2019-2020 service agreement. In the agreement, it details the prior baseline services and what additional miles and services the agreement incorporates, the costing for those services, and the corridors that the routes will continue on. We have moved forward in that because we've had a mobilization that you were presented on earlier this year. So those routes are the 2, the 9, and the 21 that will be implemented in August. The total cost for this revenue contract is a little over $4.3 million. So Laura's going to take you through kind of the whole cycle quickly. I think we have a presentation of those pieces.
that's great.
Thank you. Kathy and Jana, do you mind going back just one slide, please? Oh, Nicole's got it. Thank you. Let's see. Oh, never mind. So Salt Lake City developed a transit master plan that we helped fund and our staff helped develop. And it is really a long-range plan for Salt Lake City on how their transit service will look in the future. It includes a whole bunch of corridors that they call FTNs, or frequent transit network. And the idea here is that the service runs every 15 minutes, 7 days a week, starts early in the morning, runs late at night, and providing really the opportunity for Salt Lake City residents to make lifestyle choices around the transit system, maybe living downtown, maybe eliminating the need for a car. And so once they completed the development of this master plan, we then got together and said, okay, how do we implement it? And they said, what if we provide some funding to help advance the development of these? And so we then started working on this interlocal agreement together. A few of the key considerations, things that we had to work through as we were developing this, was striking that right balance between flexibility and specificity. We can be incredibly precise in our costing, and it's ultra complex, or we can be a little bit more kind of rule of thumb ballpark, and it's simpler. And so we were trying to strike the right balance that provided the transparency and the assurance for both us and Salt Lake City that we were getting a good deal and being fair to one another and to taxpayers. The sponsored transit service also needed to fit within Salt Lake City's Funding Our Future. That's their sales tax increase program, into that larger context, as well as all of our long-term plans here at UTA.
We tried to develop an ILA that created the opportunity for a template for other communities that might want to sponsor service in the future. And so this was really the first time we've done this with a local government. We learned a lot along the way, but we're hopeful now that we have a template and a plan and something that we might be able to take to other communities at some point in the future. We've also learned some lessons along the way on things that we might want to fix next time, or next time we revisit this. The other big challenge was we all have different schedules. Salt Lake City is on a July 1 fiscal year. We're on a January 1 fiscal year. We have our change day schedule. And the FTA produces the National Transit Database agency profiles in October every year. So we had all these different schedules that we're trying to bring together. And then factoring the administrative costs were another big factor that we really needed to negotiate. So the structure of the agreement is organized around a master interlocal agreement that really outlines the rules and how we partner with one another. This really creates the framework. It sets up the structure on how we calculate the costs of the service, but it doesn't actually convey any money or talk about any specific routes at that point. It's just the framework. Addendum number 1 that you approved along with the interlocal agreement last February or March created the funding to help us mobilize to provide this service in August. And so that allowed us to procure the fabrication of new buses, start hiring and training operators, hiring mechanics and supervisors, really all of the preparation work that it takes to prepare to deliver the service. Today, we've brought you addendum number 2, which is the transfer of the funding that actually allows us to provide the operating service itself. We anticipate this being, it's a 20-year agreement, the master ILA, but we anticipate every single year coming back to both Salt Lake City and UTA saying, here's the funding and the cost for this next year's service. Salt Lake City anticipates providing or sponsoring additional service in the future, so we see that going up. Yes, please.
One thing I failed to mention last night, they're budgeting for in the 2019-2020 budget that they allowed a higher amount estimated for services. What they did do is pull the amount, it was probably 5.3 million, so they probably have another million. They did set it aside, but they held it for transportation and transit infrastructure. So that could come back to us in capital needs or fare and marketing. So what you see is that commitment to continue providing, kind of helping and promoting this service long term, and having those dedicated funds as long as they can within the guidelines of what they can do as a council. So I think it's good for us to know that we both have risks on both sides, but you can see them dedicating what they can to UTA and that commitment with the partnership. So there is another $1 million just set aside for service on top of capital money. So go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, there are some other elements too, that they're doing bus stop improvements and a variety of other things, some fare programming as well. So there's a lot of things built into their sponsorship of this transit service. So we'll come back to you next year with another addendum. And when we start adding additional routes, there will be a mobilization addendum associated with those new routes as well. So, the costing, the process to develop what the cost of the transit service is was a complex and long process. And we ultimately came up with a calculator that's on the screen here, which is really too small to see. But the gist of it is that it is based on the National Transit Database agency profile cost per mile of transit service. The benefit of doing this is that every single transit agency in the nation has an agency profile on the website. So anyone in the public can log on there. They can compare us to other regions. It's very transparent and it's consistent. And so we can pull that number of cost per mile, plug it into the calculator along with the number of miles that they are sponsoring, and it will give us a cost. We have broken out, there's a variety of different factors. Fuel costs can go up and down. The interest rate on leasing buses can go up and down. Paratransit costs vary based on how much service we're providing and what the baseline service looks like. And so all of these things, all of those different factors are different variables that we've broken out separately to provide us a lot of cover so that if all of a sudden the cost of fuel goes through the roof, we have a way to calculate for that and protect ourselves against it. So it took a long time to work through this. Some lessons learned. One of the challenges I think with it is that we have based it on cost per mile, whereas the cost per hour is much more impactful from a transit agency's perspective. We landed on miles because it seemed more tangible and more understandable for the general public. We may, after we implement the service, see what it really ends up costing us. We may go back and negotiate with the city and say, maybe we want to look at hours also and see if there's an opportunity there.
There's also an escalator in there that we can look at. So you're looking at, as we did this agreement, it was on the 2017 NTD number. So we put a 2-year escalator in there. So if we needed to adjust that, because you hope the hours eventually match up within those 2 years. So there's a lot of things there's some variables that we can work on to make sure that we're hitting that mark. But to Laura's point, the transparency was really important for us to have something that's consistent, but we also need to make sure we can provide the service, and I think Salt Lake City understands that. But I think there's some other variables in there that we can make sure that we have the money we need to run the service.
And big thanks to Lauren Simpson and his team and all of the operations planners and then my service planning team. There's a lot of work that has gone into this, and many, many hours and moments of frustration and moments of, yes, we made a breakthrough, and we feel really, really good about it. I'm very excited. So these are the corridors that we are sponsoring this first time. We tried really hard in the agreement to talk specifically about corridors rather than routes. And as we get into the actual operational planning of these, the different end-of-line points and the particular streets that we travel on, sometimes a left turn is challenging to make. And so we've tried really hard to make this general and talk about corridors rather than specific routes, but these are representative of how we'll actually be operating the service. So 2nd South goes from Salt Lake Central up to the University of Utah. The 900 South corridor really connects the Poplar Grove and Glendale neighborhoods to East High School and up to the University of Utah and the hospital. So that's a really critical service for those communities. And then 2100 South as well will go up to the university and come down to the tracks line at Central Point.
Can I ask a question on that 9th South option that goes up to East? A lot of the students now in the, well, it has for quite some time in Poplar Grove, Glendale, go to East High. Do they take the bus, or does the district have to bus them? Or?
So they haven't in the past because we provided really dismal service. So this will really change things for them.
This was the 9th South route this is my favorite route because when I worked at Sorensen Unity Center, so the kids have to take the city bus, or excuse me, the school bus. So we talked to Lexi Cunningham, the superintendent, a few years ago about if they miss the bus, they have no other way of getting up to East High or Highland. And so in talking with Salt Lake City yesterday, it's getting passes in those kids' hands and getting all the barriers so that if they're tardy is less barrier to them for school than actually missing a whole day of school. And so having a route that's going 15 minutes, 30 minutes is really going to help them in school. So they have to take the school bus now, but now for extracurricular activities, because we started earlier and we end late, they have an option. So I think you would see a negotiation with the school and Salt Lake City and us to see how we can use all of our taxpayer money to benefit the kids on that side of town to make sure they have access to.
I mean, it just strikes me long term. It's kind of crazy to run yellow school buses across town if you're got a transit option.
That was the ultimate goal. We talked about looking at the extended services, so those after-school programs first. They were really interested in having a conversation about before and after school and seeing if that's something that UTA could talk about. And then especially 9, 21, West High, some things like that. So I think you're right on track with what the school system is looking at, and the school board is supportive.
There's a similar issue with Highland High School. All of the school boundaries are really linear across the city. So the ultimate goal is to have the 21 extend further west as well. We have some physical barriers with the freeway and railroad tracks that are challenging to provide the transit service all the way across right now, but that's part of the long-term vision as well.
So I just had another follow-up question on that. So is there a design to have those communications with the Salt Lake, with the district in coming up, or are you going to wait a year and do analysis? How's that going to look?
I think right now, Salt Lake City, along with Monica and Andrea, are doing assessment on fares. No one, I think, how this community outreach piece works with the fares piece, and then seeing what those barriers are. And I was going to tell you at the end of this, I think we're going to be coming back to you again on some of these pieces of what are these barriers and what will they want to do. The council is looking at what they want to do to increase access to their Hive Pass, access to the youth. And so working with our team, they're going to have some proposals. And so not to jump ahead of that outreach piece and then come back to you also about some of the proposals that they'll want to put forward. They're interested in your fare policy. They asked if that was going to what kind of route that's taking and how that aligns with some of the ideas of the council and the city of breaking down the barriers. But I think we're all aligned at getting people on the buses and using these services. So I think once we see this outreach approach, we can come back with some suggestions of how do we work with the city, how do we work with the school district and the university of making sure that we have access to all of these new routes. So I think you're going to see that in the next 3 months.
Thank you.
How many additional buses were needed and operators to implement this?
I do. Yes, we need.
System.
It's in our brains.
Yes, branded in my brain. We needed 10 additional buses to provide this service and about 37 operators. And so the vast majority of the additional buses and operators are needed on the Night South service. That's a 418% increase in transit service on that route. And so, yeah, it's fairly significant.
Okay, thank you.
I have just a couple more slides. So I mentioned that this was a 20-year agreement, and the city intended to sponsor additional service moving forward. The corridors highlighted in green are identified as the next phase, the next step of implementation of this, and that's really largely serving the Rose Park area on 600 North, 10th North, and then you'll see 4th South as well that extends along Foothill Drive. And then this is a map of the city's entire transit master plan with our existing bus and rail lines overlain on top. The orange lines are the future FTN corridors. The blue is our existing bus routes, and the yellow is our existing rail line. So you can see it's a fairly extensive vision, and we have a lot of opportunities to work together and to really increase transit service and serve the Salt Lake City community better moving forward into the future. And that is my last slide. Any other questions that we can answer for you all?
No, just that last map should be a reminder for all those who gave up on the Plat of Zion, so for transit purposes. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for that update.
We need a decision.
We'll go to that.
Okay.
Thanks for the update. And then, are there any other questions, though, staff? No. Okay. Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion on the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we pass this resolution authorizing the execution of this addendum number 2 that has been explained so well to us.
And I excitedly second that.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Seeing no other discussion, I'll ask for a roll call.
Trustee Millington?
Aye.
Trustee Holbrook?
Aye.
Chair Christensen?
Aye.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item up is a resolution authorizing the execution of a memorandum of understanding with the University of Utah and delegating authority to the executive director for construction of the Union Building bus base project. Steve?
Thank you, Chair. We've, as part of the Salt Lake City service project, we've been working with them and the university about bus access to the university. And what we saw was a challenge there with the number of buses and the frequency of service up at the hospital itself. And so the university was desirous in the hospital to relocate that hub, that staging area. And they've landed at the Union Building. So with that, there's the need to construct some bus bay improvements there. Time is short on this one, very short fuse on this. They're in the process of approving design right now, and they want that constructed by the beginning, before the beginning of classes, the 12th, 19th of August. So I think we want it done so Carolyn comes in the first day and has a nice new bus bay. Perfect. And so as we looked at that with the capital development team has worked on that, the 3-year on-call contract that we have with Stacy and Wetbeck seems to be appropriate in order to mobilize and get that done within the time that we have. The university's been working on the design with they've had an engineering contract to do that. We did have a grant for that, so we have the $372,000 from the Federal Transit Administration, $27,000 from Salt Lake City that they're putting towards this as well. So we're right under $400,000. If you take a look at this on the map, north is to the left. Yeah, that's pretty good for me. I took one class at the U, so I didn't get up there too often. But so that's the Union. You took a number?
I took quite a bit myself.
There you go. Okay, very good.
I think the Union's there in the bottom right.
Yeah,
correct. Yeah.
So you can see those bus bays down there at the bottom of the picture, and then a couple up at the top, and a new driveway in to try to separate some of the automobile traffic from that bus circulation. So, we're going to have quite a frequency of service there, a lot of buses moving in and out, and I think that'll really be a benefit to those people that do come and park, those few people that come and park. Most people are taking transit, so we want to make that as convenient as possible. So that's the project, and because of that time frame and trying to quickly get this contract negotiated and go forward, we're asking for this resolution for execution of the MOU with the city and the university, and my delegating ability to me to allow to execute that construction contract.
Questions for Steve? I will say, actually, I think it's a really good resolution because really our rail service doesn't serve very well the heart of the campus, certainly not over on the north side. And I think in many ways, taking like from a Salt Lake Central up Second South to this location gets you more in the heart of the campus, probably as effectively as almost anything they have currently.
Yeah, so we have this. We have the university has their bus shuttle across campus, which we'll soon be running some additional electric buses on. So yeah, we really are trying to cover various points on campus.
I'm excited. I think that'll be great.
Entertain a motion on this resolution.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the resolution authorizing execution of the MOU with the University of Utah and delegating authority to the executive director for the construction of the Union Building bus bays project.
I'll second that motion.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll ask for a roll call.
Trustee Holbrook.
Aye.
Trustee Millington.
Aye.
Chair Christensen.
Aye.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
So, good luck. That's a short time frame.
I know football's starting soon. No pressure.
This team really operates well under pressure.
Okay. Well, we have great confidence in them. So, next item up is our contracts, disbursements, and grants item. And first item up is the Point of the Mountain Transit project with parametrics. And Michael Demers.
Thank you, Mr.
There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and other trustees for this opportunity to come and present this contract today for your review and approval. My name is Michael Demers, as Chief Service Development Officer here at the Utah Transit Authority. I oversee the Capital Development Department, which is managing this project and Patty Garver from Capital Development is joining us today to assist on some of the details and the technical implementation of this study. A little bit of background on this particular proposal or transit concept. Many areas within the UTA service area are requesting additional service, whether it's bus or other modes, in some cases rail modes, light rail, commuter rail. This particular study would look at the southern reaches of Salt Lake County and the northern parts of Utah County to see in what circumstances and growth development patterns additional service would be merited. What I think is noteworthy about this particular contract is while the Phase 1 and Phase 2 scope and budget do total $800,000, Phase 1 is $550,000, and only $50,000 of that is coming from Utah Transit Authority cash. So we are achieving great leverage for the enterprise in accessing resources from other government entities and planning reasonably and responsibly for the transit future of this region. Phase 2 being $250,000, we cannot proceed unless we secure and find the $250,000 for Phase 2. So this approval that you are reviewing and considering today is for the initial $550,000 for Phase 1 of this particular contract. And we'll take any questions, and Patty is here to comment and advise on the technical aspects of the study.
What's the time frame of the scope?
1 year.
1 year?
Yeah.
From today or?
From when the contract is signed.
Okay. So we won't have, effectively, we won't have any sort of tangible results until, I mean, yeah, like thinking even in legislative terms, you're really 2 legislative sessions away probably before you have
Well,
answers.
we'll have alternatives identified. The final won't be for a year, but we'll have public meetings along the way to give the public ideas of what we have identified. So we'll have ideas of what the alternatives
could be.
Yeah.
And that will be part of the public process when you're going out to these various areas.
Yeah.
And that's funded through the 1 through 4 tasks. Is that right? So
Yeah.
that's the funded portion.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably, the last public meeting would be part of the second phase.
Okay. That we're still not, we don't have the funding yet.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
And what tasks would be in 5 and 6?
Well, task 5 is the ultimate alternatives analysis, and then task 6 is operation and maintenance funding.
Okay.
To identify where we would get the funding to operate and maintain whatever the alternative ends up being.
Okay.
So the majority of the document will be funded with the money that we have. It'll just be the ultimate document and completion of the final document with the Phase 2 funding.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Or?
How does this particular study blend with the effort that's being done by the Point of the Mountain Commission?
Well,
I think there
Is this the study?
Yeah. There's also a study that's being completed in Utah County. Is that the one you're talking about? By UTA?
Well, there's 2 of them, and I'm wondering where.
So we have
where
our
the overlap
document.
is.
Our document will go pretty much to Lehigh, and then there's a study being completed in Utah County, which will go from the border of Utah County south of where our project will go. But
So-
we're working together, and that
Okay.
project is a little bit behind our schedule.
All right, thank you.
And I think, Trustee, what you'll see is this will influence a lot of the decision-making on the prison side, right? We're looking east side versus west side type of corridor, the east side being the existing rail corridor that we had purchased. West side is a proposed street running scenario. Whichever one's chosen there influences then how service proceeds on to into Utah County as well as into the prison site. So I think, that's important information for them as that group moves forward. That it's important information that, like Patty talked about, that study that's talking about the Utah County portion as well.
But there will definitely be overlap, but we're working together.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I did have one other question.
Please, Beth.
So the two studies that you're talking about, is that two different organizations entirely, or is that all the point of the Mountain Commission?
It's two different.
So
Well, I mean,
so
this study
Utah
is
County
UTA.
Right.
That study is UDOT.
Is UDOT. Okay.
Point
Thank
of
you.
the Mountain Commission is not
They're not doing-
officially
They're not officially
part of
either one.
either. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion on this contract.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve this Point of the Mountain Transit Project contract.
I will second.
I have a motion and a second. Other discussion? Seeing none, I'll ask for a roll call.
Trustee Millington,
Aye?
Trustee Holbrook,
Aye.
Chair Christensen.
Aye.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Patty. Next is a pre-procurement for lawn care and landscaping services for multiple locations, which doesn't include my house, I'm sure.
That is correct. We don't have that kind of capacity.
Yeah.
to just do that. As the lead associate gardener at my house, I chose to talk about this item myself. But, Kevin Anderson, the head of facilities maintenance, is here to answer detailed questions of this. So this is a multi-year, a contract for multi-year procurement for lawn care and landscaping services. As Kevin looks and manages his work, what can the staff handle in the normal day-to-day, what can they take on, and they're seeing that they need this extra capacity to contract this out. It's not something that would make sense to add staff for, because you couldn't keep them busy year-round, and with the type of expertise we need in the facilities maintenance team. So be going out for procurement on that. We'd be coming out with a base period with several option years on that contract.
What are you doing now, Kevin? I mean, is this just a sort of a renewal opportunity? Okay.
It is a renewal opportunity. That's how we've done it in the past, and the contract is up, and so.
Okay. And does the current contract go, I assume, through the end of this season? Or?
It doesn't. Right now, we worked with purchasing and got an extension, a temporary extension. So this one will start in the fall.
Oh, in the fall?
Yeah.
Okay. And, and does it include basically any UTA property that has landscaping or?
Not all. There are a few that we still do in-house, but it's about 38 UTA properties, park and rides. Well, we have train stations, the park and rides, front runner stations, the intermodal hubs, bus and train repair facilities, and the admin buildings. So about 38 locations total will be under contract.
So all of those are the public-facing locations. Would that be correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
You had a question, though. I'm sorry.
He answered it with the number.
Okay.
Is there a reason why, not that us mowing our own lawns or doing stuff is bad, but is there a reason we don't include all of our properties? Is there a security reason or just more traditional?
More traditional. There's a few locations where we use our service employees just because we had the equipment from years past, and that's more traditional how we did it. Okay. And as we expand, when we started doing it a long time ago, we didn't have nearly the amount of work. And so as we expand, we've contracted it out rather than buy the equipment and hire people for basically seasonal jobs.
That's why I wondered, like, if down the road, if you are better off really just contracting this out and then using your service folks to do the increasing service work you got.
So when Kevin and I worked together, and we would look at that and we'd say, what are our needs in the winter for our snow removal?
Yeah.
And becomes kind of critical to call out what can you legitimately contract out on that side, but what do you want to have your forces to do so that you know you've got a response going on there, and then balance yourself seasonally so you have a staff that's productive year round.
Okay. All right. I think this is information only, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. The second one here also involves Kevin. He enjoys having roofs that don't leak, and we've got one that leaks. At this OK Manufacturing building, this is located south of the Jordan River Service Center. And you heard last time about the facility's master plan, intend to keep that building and keep it in service. So as those decisions have been made, we said, what needs to be done from a repair standpoint. So this would be a procurement to get a new roof membrane. You can only put so many Band-Aids on a roof is the way I'm understanding it. So at some point you got to replace the whole membrane.
We don't anticipate, it didn't seem like from the facilities discussion that we would add on to this building in any.
That's not the intent right now.
No,
Mostly
it's a
retrofit.
really large building. We have extra space there now, so no,
Okay.
we won't be adding on
No
to
need
it.
to. Okay. All right. Great. Any other questions on this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Item number 11 is for discussion items, and first is our Amendment 2 for our capital budget in 2019. Bob?
We have two budget amendments today. We'll start with budget amendment number 2. Okay. Let me get situated to make sure things don't get blown away by that high volume fan that's on me right now. So we have two budget amendments today. The budget amendment number 2 is really the capital portion of this. And there's two things. One is the Salt Lake County fourth quarter money that's coming in this year. We originally showed it in our operating budget. There's a portion of it that we're recommending goes toward capital projects. The second one is an e-voucher software purchase that we've been successful in getting a grant to work with other agencies to develop this software. So as we look at the fourth quarter, we're looking at allocating about $3.5 million of that $6 million towards data good repair, really the track system and our overhaul project. And then the remainder, about $2.5 million for various capital projects. One's the depot district behind this building, expansion of Meadowbrook, operator restroom, and then bus stops and improvements and signage. And we provided some detailed information on each of these projects in your packet. If you have questions on those, Mary will come and rescue me on those questions. The second one is the e-voucher software. We received a grant. This is the first year, and it has all of the UTA funding in this particular year. And so it shows a grant of $84,000. And I believe next year it's in the $700,000 range. So this is a pretty extensive project. And again, we've provided some detail about what this particular project entails. So what that does to the actual budget, it takes it from $165 million up to $171 million, with the sales tax moving from operating into capital. And then these two other sources of funding, one's grant, and then the current year funding is just, from our resources. But we try to keep track of that so we know how much we're paying out of our resources. And then this is what it looks like on the expense side. State grid repairs increased by $3.5 million, and other capital projects, including the voucher, is $2,750,000. So again, it takes it up to $171 million. Something I should mention, I should have put a slide in for this. We're looking at state good repair, adding 2 headcount for our PTC work that needs to be done. And when we bring this back in 2 weeks, I'll give you a slide showing the change in the headcount for that, moving it from contract to headcount. So the next steps, I'll talk to the advisory council later today on amendment number 2, and then it'll come back to you on July 31st with any comments that the advisory council has. Questions on this particular amendment?
Tell me what an e-voucher is.
Okay, someone else is going to have to help me on that.
Maybe. Oh, this is part of the UTA
It's part of
Coordinated Mobility.
Yeah, it's part of the Coordinated Mobility Department. Is to replace the manual voucher paper system that we currently have.
Okay.
And so I can just read this. It's a web-based application for providers to keep track of clients, drivers, payments, programs, and will include a mobile app. So the mobile app will help the drivers as well as the clients.
Okay. I remember seeing on our tour a software that we shared with providers, but that was more on the maintenance side. So I didn't know that we had something on the sort of payment voucher side as well.
See, remember we've talked about this to try to get the various groups that had vehicles available and try to optimize that use, and this fits in with that.
Okay. All right. Questions for Bob? I'm guessing that takes us to budget amendment number 3.
Yes, budget amendment number 3. Thank you. So this one is really about reallocating some of the money in the operations portion of the budget. And there's really 4. Planning, customer experience. We're transferring some headcount from planning to customer experience. Salt Lake County fourth quarter. This is the other side of the $6 million transaction. You heard earlier about the Salt Lake City purchase service. And so this reallocation will reduce the total amount and put the money into the respective budgets. And then the parts freight expense, we had an oversight as we prepared the budget. Somehow that didn't get in. So it's really just a correction. So the first one is transferring budget from planning to customer experience. Again, it's 3 headcount, and I assume some associated expense with that particular group. So it's a net 0. It's just moving from, in your official budget, from general and administrative down to the planning, real estate, TOD, major development. That's our non-operating section. The second one is the Salt Lake County fourth quarter. Again, just moving that sales tax from operations budget down into the capital budget, which was an amendment 2, and then reducing the amount that we showed on the expense side for Salt Lake County service. Because again, that moves from operations down into capital. The Salt Lake City purchase service, this does a couple of things. If you look down near the bottom, there was $4,950,000 that we had as one line in the budget because we didn't know exactly how that was going to be allocated. So what this amendment is doing is allocating that to bus, paratransit, operations support, general administrative, and then reducing the debt service amount too for our projections. It also includes the estimate for the mobilization cost that Laura was talking about, as well as the operations cost from when this begins through the end of the year. So the net of that was a reduction of $1.8 million in this year's budget. We get into next year's budget, we'll have the full operations for the full year. The mobilization costs will go away. And then if there's any adjustments with this other $1 million that was being talked about, that may show up in next year's budget also. I should mention here, as far as headcount, I should have put a slide in here. There's 50 headcount associated with the Salt Lake City purchase services. There's 43 in Salt Lake Central. That includes, my notes say 39 operators. Paratransit has 5 headcount. The Chief People Office has 1 for a recruiter because we have to make sure we have all the operators can get them, as well as the paratransit folks. And then 1 addition to customer service to answer any questions that comes about from this new service. And then the last one is parts freights expense. That got left out of the budget. So if we'd had that in the budget, this is where it would have been in those departments, and the contributions to reserves would have been the offset. So that's all that does, is implement what should have been in the budget. So the net impact to the operating budget is actually a decrease in the budget from 459 million down to 451. And the same thing on the expense side. And you can see the next to last lines where we're taking money from the Salt Lake service and from the Salt Lake County service and reallocating that either to capital or within the operations. And so the operation expense goes down from about 306 million to about 299. The non-operating, the second line here, goes down because we're moving it from non-operating over to an operating budget. And then principal and interest is down because of the Salt Lake City, and the early debt retirement reserve goes down a little bit. The contribution from the current year goes down. We still have our commitment to put in the debt service savings, but the funding from the current year goes down a little bit. And so again, on the operating side, the expense side, the budget goes from 459 million to 451 million. And next step here is bring it back to you with a resolution on July 31st.
More for a point of information, how do you usually deal with freight? I mean, is it just anticipated as part of the cost of the part or whatever is being purchased?
Sure. There's a couple of things on freight, right? You want to minimize the amount, and so we've taken steps in the last several years to minimize those urgent needs where you have to have it air freighted in and that sort of thing. So the supply chain folks have done a good job minimizing that, working with the operating departments to understand our needs. Occasionally we have to do that, but we try to minimize that. So it's essentially a part expense of the parts cost.
Questions for Bob? All right. And either amendment, we're looking at the 31st?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Good. Thanks for that presentation, Bob. And I guess this is Steve, and you're probably not going to let Bob move.
I'm not going to let him move. No.
The UTA Transit Financial Plan, or the TFP.
Yeah, so our TFP is an important look ahead at what we think the parameters are going to be in future year budgets. And so we're in the process of updating that now to reflect the changes we think we're seeing in our projections going forward of our costs and our potential revenue streams. And then, so that helps guide us. And particularly as we look at this year's budget, and we're starting to plan with a 5-year capital plan and a 5-year service plan. All those things fit together and make the need for adjusting these parameters important so that we get what we think the closest to current reality projection of where we're going to be with budget. So Bob and the executive team and then all the staff associated in the different departments have all been working really hard to look at all these factors, and I'll let Bob take you through what the assumptions we're looking at.
So thanks, Steve, for the intro, because the Transit Financial Plan really is a long-term look at what you think will happen. You know, as you're in the shorter years, it's obviously more firm than when you're out in the long-term years. Our particular plan right now goes through 2050, so lots of things can happen between now and then, right? But the main thing that we try to do with the Transit Financial Plan, there's a couple of things. One's to understand the impact of revenue and expense changes. Sales tax growth would be an example. You know, we report that every month. This year's estimate's 5%. We're not looking at 5% right now. So as we work on the TFP, we're going to look at even the current year as well as the future years and make that change and then see how it ripples through the plan. Well, that applies to fares, grant funding, personnel cost, mandates that might come through, like a positive train control mandate that came through and required about $40 million. Things of that nature that just show up, good things and things that require use of resources. Then the second thing you want to look at is, okay, we're talking about proposed changes. How does that impact our long-term financial plan? If you add new service, do you have the revenues to support that, just not in the short term, but the long term? Also, same thing with capital project. You have to look at the capital side of that as well as the operating side of that. And based on what we know, does this work within our long-term financial plan? So all of these things can occur in a very short time. And the intent is to use this to adjust. As assumptions change, we look at what do we have to do to adjust with it.
Can I ask just a fundamental question? Is TFP a UTA acronym, or is that more of a transit industry?
It's us.
Okay. I mean, I think it's the concept itself is great. I just didn't know if we went to a transit conference and we said the TFP, would people look at us like...
They would look at you and wonder what you were talking about. Okay. You're throwing out a completely new acronym for them, and
okay. That's shocking. But
they have their standard list, and yeah, we'd be beyond that. It is, I think, somewhat unique. I don't know that there's very many. We haven't seen very many organizations that have this far of a look ahead, and your reliability in those future years goes down. But to have a base set of assumptions so that we can work with our MPOs on their long-range plans and have a consistent understanding of that. And it demonstrates these changes, like Bob's saying, if we look at this year's sales tax and we make an adjustment, it has a significant impact down the road. And so keeping up on this, I think, is a very valuable tool for UTA.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the other thing to think about with the transit financial plan, it's what is today, our service, the things we know about, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but it does not include electrification of front runner, for instance. That's in a planning stage, and at some point when that becomes something we're going to do, it would show up in the transit financial plan. So putting together a transit financial plan.
You have a question, but I'll follow in case you don't ask.
I don't. When you say it like that, so what you're saying that the as I'm understanding you, the transit financial plan is actually just defined projects, revenue changes, grant funding, personnel, all of that is defined. So as juxtaposed against like electrification or double tracking. Okay,
Correct.
Just wanted to clarify things.
And along that same breath, would you assume things like studies, like doing environmental work, or even just the conceptual stuff?
I think right now, if we haven't defined it, what Bob will show in the plan is available revenue to do those things, but it hasn't been assigned to a specific project.
Yeah. All right.
And we do know plans that are going to be coming up 5 years from now. There's the system study we have to do every 5 years. So one of the changes we've made since the last TFP is we've gone out and said, okay, what studies do we know we have to do over the next 5 years? And let's incorporate that into the next TFP. So we continue to try to improve how this projects, making sure we account for the things that we know have to be done. So I tried to figure out how to show this in a simple method. And really what a TFP is how much money do you have and how do you want to spend it? And how much money do you need to have at the end of every year is the way to think of it. So the available resources are really made up of two things. It's your beginning balance, and that can include your restricted as well as unrestricted funds, and then the revenues that you think are going to come in during that year. And so those are a lot of estimates. We'll talk about a couple of those. But then the use of resources, debt service, I didn't put estimated on there. We do have one bond issue scheduled for next year. So, okay, that's estimated. And we do have leases that are estimated, but generally debt service is fixed. Because it's the long-term stuff, it goes through 2042. We know exactly how much we have to pay each year. Whereas the operating budget and then the estimated capital, and I really broke it into two areas. One's maintaining what we have, and then the second's adding new assets. If you look in our budget, we break it out that way. We've got state of good repair, and then we have new capital. And so part of the decision is, how do you take those available resources and allocate it among those three major buckets of expense? Well, four, but debt service is already kind of taken off the top. And then after year one, you go and say, okay, that's how much I have at the end of the year. I move that forward to year two. You do the same thing for year two. Then you take your balance at the end of year two, move it to year three, and so on and so forth. And so the goal is to make sure, for whatever length of time you do a TFP, again, we're doing 2050, is all that bottom line in every year needs to be at least the restricted funds and any other unrestricted balances that you want to keep.
Can I ask a question in terms of, it would appear that there's some fluidity in the sense that you have debt service in there, but really we know that debt service is mostly fixed, right?
Correct.
And you have the ability, obviously you're looking to 2050, so you could add things and change things. So on average, how often is this an annual review? I know you have it 1, 2, and 3, and then you just break it out to the 50-year mark? Am I understanding that correctly?
Say that last line one more time.
So you have each year that you're doing it. So for this year, just for assumption purposes, you're doing 2019. And then you're going to move forward to 2050, right? And then
Correct.
With those basic assumptions, even though there could be changes to that.
Correct.
Okay.
And so you asked the questions on my next slide. How often do we look at it? Well, we look at it 3 times a year, actually. These, to us, make sense that we do it after the annual audit. We know what the actual 2018 numbers were, and we know what our ending balance came out to be. And so we check the ending balance and, how close were we? This year we were within $200,000 of what we projected. So felt pretty good about that. So we made that adjustment. Now we're in the part where we're looking at preliminary budget information. And so we're going in, and as Steve said, we're looking at the current year, and then we're looking at future year assumptions and trying to make decisions of what's the right number to put in there. And then what happens is that gets tempered by, okay, based upon the available resources, what adjustments do we have to make on the expense side to make this work, and that we have the minimum balance every year, at least the minimum balance every year. And then the next point where we look at it is right around the adoption of the annual budget, making sure that what we have in that final budget proposal works in the long term for us. So to us, those are the natural breaks of updating this. And so it's been our policy to update it 3 times a year as assumptions change and we know about it. So for instance, we're looking at lease bids right now. And so that will, whatever those rates are, will adjust the leases going forward for this year. Hopefully they're less. I haven't seen the numbers yet. And so that's an adjustment that we would just go ahead and incorporate in this preliminary budget information. But if it were after the preliminary budget, well, we'd go ahead and note that and have it ready for the annual budget, because that would be included in the annual budget. So what I was intending to do today was just look at what was in our budget book. So you can see the current TFP. As Steve said, we're working on some of the assumptions. I'll point out a few of them that we know we have to work on. So here's a very condensed summary of our TFP. The main thing to look at here is down at the bottom in the ending December 31 balances. So we show that we're going from the beginning of this year, $237 million. At the end of 2023, $109 million. Now, a lot of that happens because we're using some of that $237 million for capital. We've been doing that for a few years. We've been using those balances that we've had to help pay for some capital. One-time money, one-time use. And then the other major factor, if you look in 2022, is using the early debt retirement fund to retire debt. Again, we've talked about that several times, that when you get to 2021, think about that one long and hard. Well, that's just part of the story. The other part is you have to look at your reserves and what's required, and these have been changed in June with your financial policies, but this is what was in the budget book. And so I always look at that unrestricted line, because that tells you, are you meeting your required reserves or not? And so in 2021, 2022, it gets a little thin in those years, but we're still meeting our reserve requirements. And now again, you have to look at that $98 million in debt rate stabilization and think about what you want to do there. But that unrestricted reserve line is what I look at in the TFP. That has to be in the black every year. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the key assumptions that were in that January TFP. Sales tax, we've used 5%. Our historical has been in the 5.3 to 5.4%, looking at a 25-year average. But there's variation between years. So this year in 2019, the 3-month trend that we'll be reporting to you with the June financial statements, we're at 3.2%. The 12-month moving average is right at 5. So it's going to be somewhere between 3.2 and 5. But we'll be making a call on that and making a recommendation to you in a couple of weeks on what we think the 2019 number should be. Right now, I think we're probably sticking with the 5% from 2020 on, but again, we're going to be talking about that as a staff. Adjustments down here means that there's less resources available. And so there has to be adjustment for that. Federal preventative maintenance, there's really two things. This is a federal formula allocation, and there's two things that drive it. One is the amount of service that we provide. That determines how much of the piece of the pie that we get of all the money available. Last time I checked, we were 0.7%. We got 0.7% of the total funding. So if we add service, that could increase our percentage, but it depends on what every other transit agency is doing also. If a system adds a lot of service somewhere else, well, that could shrink our pie. It's marginal, but again, it affects the preventive maintenance dollars that you would get. The second thing is how much the federal government adds to that amount of money every year. And so we try to estimate both of those and how they drive that. Again, we look at legislation and what we think is going to happen. It's a very involved calculation, and we've got some folks on staff who've done a lot of work trying to model the federal allocation formula so we can do our projections. Passenger revenue in 2020 included an estimated fare increase. With the timing and looking at how long it takes to go through that process, that won't happen in 2020. So we're looking at moving that from 2020 to 2021 just as a placeholder. Obviously, the board will be talking about that as we move further into the year and what you want to do to even look at that. And then interest is an interesting one. We take the Congressional Budget Office projections and we add 75 basis points. So there's two things we look at. We go get the latest Congressional Budget Office report. They update it twice a year. And then we'll adjust for that. And then the next thing we'll look at is 75 basis points the right margin between what the Congressional Budget Office is saying and how our investments are performing. Questions on just, again, these are the major revenue assumptions on the operation budget.
One question. Well, I think you answered it. On the passenger decline, it's just, why would it drop so much?
So often when there's a rate increase, we see slight decline in ridership. And so that takes into account there could be a decline.
Okay.
I just had a question on the preventative maintenance portion. Adjusting down, is that because of uncertainty with the federal government side in terms of their reimbursement, or is there some other thing that impacts that?
Sure. So in some of the years, what you see is just the increase in the federal, what they've got scheduled to increase the size of the amount of money available. In 2021, what you're seeing is that plus a rail system that becomes eligible for preventative maintenance. It's 7 years after it's placed in service, but then it has to get reported to NTD. So it's about 8 years before we become eligible for the allocation formula for our rail systems. So that's the 2013 service that was put in place. So another key assumption is operating expense. And the first thing I'd point out about that, this is done in 2017. And so we know we have to update this, but there's a couple of things we want to do. We want to break this out into more areas because we can do some forecasting in different line items and then come up with a number. And so what's in the TFP right now is 2.75%. And how we got there is looking at the weight of expense, taking it times an estimated growth rate for that category. And it's just a calculation of that's the percent growth that would be attributable to that item. Adding those all together, you get 315. And then we said, well, 315 doesn't really work in our TFP. And so we had to do a challenge of saving 0.4% every year, coming up with ideas that would reduce the expense that we currently have. And a good example would be replacing our back-end EFC system. That saved about $800,000 a year. And so that was by itself very close to that 0.4%. And so it's a challenge to staff to keep coming up with continuous improvement ideas that result in hard dollar savings.
Bob, how do you factor in on your labor? We're an organization that now has matured in the sense that next year we celebrate our 50th. You have a lot of wonderfully long-serving employees that are in there. I've seen a couple near 40 this last year, but they're retiring. You're probably not going to replace them at the same rate. Does that sort of offset itself in the sort of competitive wage rates that you anticipate?
Certainly. So there's several things that affect that, right? One is turnover, what's happening in the market. There are some positions that we have to pay more than 3% growth for those positions. There are others we don't quite have to do that, right? Because we're having higher priced people who are retiring and you're going to hire someone at a lower price. That's just the way it works. There are also some standard rate increases for some folks that are a little bit above that, steps, if you want to think of it that way. And then just the overall market, what does it take? And then you have to throw in labor negotiations too. So all of those are really factored into that growth rate. And we're, and again, this is thinking about long term. What do we think we're going to have to do on labor, medical, fuel, parts? Again, we'll break this out a little bit more for the July 31 report. What does that look like? And are those reasonable factors? And then you get into the, okay, 315 might be the right number, but that doesn't work in the TFP in the long term. It might work for 1 year, but it might not work in the long term. And so we're actually talking about, should we come up with a growth rate for next year and then a growth rate for the years after that? It's an interesting discussion internally on how do we do this, because you could come up with two different numbers. So again, that's an assumption, that's $300 million that is increased based upon this particular growth rate.
You ever want to plan for recessions, but you have to. And we've been very fortunate from a growth standpoint. You factor that in much? I mean, is that...
No.
And they're a mixed blessing because they may take some of the pressure off wages and even materials, but you also usually are affected by revenue at the same time.
Sure, we haven't tried to project when a recession might hit or when legislative changes might happen or any of those sorts of things. There are large things on the outside that can help or make things a little tougher, and it's just hard to project those. And you do bring up a point that I wanted to talk about, though, is part of what we've done in TFP is we've taken the approach, this is what is most likely to happen. You can be more conservative, which would lean toward the, if there's a recession, well, we might want to be more conservative. And so you might want to lower your revenue estimates a little bit. Obviously, there's some sort of give that has to happen. Something else has to adjust too. So a discussion we should have is how conservative do you want to be in this long-term forecast? Leasing is, we go through 2024 with our leasing program, so we're about ready to drop it off the TFP in the 5-year consideration. But this is what we have in the TFP as of January. Eddie's group went through and looked at that last fall. Well, they'll look at it again and do their best estimate. Are these still the right numbers? And then the second part of it is the lease rates themselves. So right now we've got 4.5% in for the Salt Lake City buses in our TFP this year, and we're using those same percentages going out. Well, rates have gone down, right? So blessing here, not quite so much a blessing on the investment earnings that we're trying to achieve. So there are offsets both ways on this. So again, hopefully the rates are lower than that today, and we'll be able to lower that assumption some. As far as capital expense, here's what's in the capital expense. I did note an error. Depot District should be 27.3. Another capital should be 62.2. I just pulled a wrong number on Depot District for 2019, but the 141 million is correct. And so what we do is we try to isolate those large one-time projects like the Provo Orem trip, the airport station relocation, and the Depot District from other state of good repair. And state of good repair includes things like the vehicle replacements, IT work that needs to be done on software or replacements there, facilities, you heard about some of the facilities today, as well as the rail system. And when I think of state of good repair, the issue that we have, we're pretty good on bus. It's the rail that we're still trying to determine. We're still a relatively new system. What does that state of good repair look like going forward? So we're having some discussions about that, and we'll be coming back in 2 weeks with our thoughts on that. Other capital, that's kind of the new stuff. It includes a lot of grants type of things. You're talking Tiger, you're talking Salt Lake City bus, Box Elder right-of-way, that's special revenue coming in from them that's assigned to them, the TOD parking and the Sandy and the Sugar House double track. A lot of those have grants or other funding sources with them. And then on the revenue side, again, you can see the importance of grants and how the grant amount determines kind of what happens in 2022, 2023 with the new capital. 16.5 in 22 on expense, 15.6 in revenue. So a lot of the new capital's funded by grants. We do have the one bond issue scheduled for next year, 34.7. There are the leasing numbers. We're looking more to local partners and how they can help us as well as the state to fund some of the things that we're doing. And we look at all of these. We'll look at all the capital and we'll look at all of the revenues associated with that. And we do something similar to what's in your capital budget for 2019, where we said, here's the project and here's where the money's coming from. So we have a similar type of thing for the next 5 years that we're working on. So right now we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about those budget assumptions as well as budget targets. When we prepare the TFP, that gives us a good idea of what we can do in the next fiscal year, 2020. And so we go through a process of taking the 2019 budget, taking into account any reclassifications between departments. Then we look at, for instance, Salt Lake City new service. We need to add that into people's budgets. And so we come up with, here's what your budget would be if we included, if all these items had been in your 2019 budget, what's your base budget? And then we start applying growth percentages to that and come up with, okay, here's what we think your budget should be. How does that match the TFP estimate? And then we look at that delta and say, okay, here's how much more work we have to do. So that's what the budget targets are used for.
I'm thinking I should have taken you when I bought a car last year with me, and I had to purchase back my wife's 1984 Ford, I can't remember the car, but it wasn't worth it. Good reality, sense of reality. Thank you. Questions for Bob on these? Okay. Thank you for well, it'll be good and a great process. I don't think, and I know at my work at the county, they may have had like a 5-year window, but I've never seen it go out that kind of length. So kudos to you and your staff and to the other executives who've worked on it. Let's take a recess, and then we'll come back and talk about service choices. We'll take about a 10-minute recess and reconvene at 10:35.
Can I say thank you? There you go. Yeah.
Oh,
All right, we welcome you back from our recess, and we're now long-awaited presentation on our service choices report, and we have Laura and Nicole with us, and Jarrett Walker. Thank you. And I'm not sure which one. Nicole, are you leading off? Great.
I'm going to lead off, and thank you, Chair. I just want to lead off because this is really exciting presentation for us today to talk about our findings around the UTA service choices. As you all know, communications and marketing as well as planning has really has started this outreach and community engagement piece over the last 2 years. And so it's our pleasure today to really work on something that you've told us is a priority for the board and their goals, and that's really working with the community to engage them in our public process, to make sure that we're working with our stakeholders and elevate how we commit to working with the public. So this is UTA's first expansive effort to engage the public at a broader level. And so it's exciting for us to move through this with the board, our community stakeholders, our advisory council, to really present a genuine dialogue with the public and our community stakeholders, which Jarrett and Laura will talk about what's important to them and what's important to them regarding how we provide service to our community. So what you're going to find today is Laura's going to really talk about and give you the context of the purpose of our outreach efforts, what we did during the service choices, what our goals were. And then Jarrett is going to walk you through our findings and then really pose the questions and the guidance that we need from the board moving forward. Today is in our dialogue, and then we'll be coming back to you all for those final decision points. And so we're here for questions. I'm going to turn the time over to Laura now, so take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, board. We're excited to be here. This is a big milestone for us in this project, and we're excited to report on our progress. As Nicole mentioned, I wanted to just reiterate the purposes, our goals when we set out to begin this project, what we were trying to accomplish. And really, as service planners...
Slide one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you to wherever you want to start.
Let's see. So we'll start here.
Sorry.
No, thank you for the reminder. Really, we need to set priorities as an agency. As our service planning staff goes out to define and refine our bus service network, we have a lot of different options on how we can do that. And just like any budget at home, doing more of one thing sometimes means doing less of another. And so we really needed to take a step back and say, what are our priorities? What's the role that we want our bus service to play in our region? And how do we define the bus network to surround that? At the same time, we also had this new revenue from the Salt Lake County fourth quarter coming in. And we wanted to take a step back and say, hey, community, we're listening. You're supporting us. What should we be doing with your resources to best serve the community? We had a couple of goals for our engagement process itself. We wanted to furnish the board with a clear sense of the regional transit priorities of the stakeholders in the public. We wanted to build public awareness that ridership and coverage are really distinct goals and they result in different network plans. And we wanted to strengthen our relationships with the community at the same time. As I mentioned, we're really at kind of the 50% point in this process. It's a decision point, it's an important one, and it sets the direction for the second half of the process. There are a handful of deliverables that we are producing as part of this. One is the choices report that we produced at Jarrett Walker Associates produced for us at the very beginning of the process that framed the question. Then we have the board decision memo, which is a summary of the engagement process and sets the stage up for you all to make some policy direction for us. And then the final deliverable will be a bus network plan at the end. As Nicole mentioned, we conducted a very extensive community engagement process, and we're trying really hard to be sincere to the public. Listen to them, use their responses, be reflective of that. We had a survey that we did online. We got 3,374 responses to that survey. That is comparable and actually a little bit above what some other regions have seen from similar surveys and engagement efforts. We had 112 people come to a community leader workshop where they spent 3 hours with us. We had public open houses, 75 people, largely our paratransit population attended that. We had 14 community fair booths at events, and we've done 20 plus ongoing roadshow presentations, and many, many more were reached through engagement.
Can I just thank all the staff at UTA that volunteered their time to help us do this extensive workshop. The planning team, communications, and customer service was there working in the community. And again, this is new to us, so I really appreciate the time they spent out there working with our public and our stakeholders.
Thank you. Yeah, it was kind of an all hands on deck effort. And specifically, I want to highlight Alex Boehm and Carrie Doan from our long range and strategic planning process. Alex has been the project manager for this, has done a phenomenal job keeping a lot of balls juggling in the air at the same time, and has done a great job. And so we are coming back. We're coming here today to set the stage, start a conversation, and then we'll be coming back on July 31st. And we're looking to you to help adopt a statement that sets us up with some policy direction on this ridership coverage split. We want you to consider the results of the engagement process, the feedback that you'll hear this afternoon from the local advisory council, and also your own values. And I want to reiterate that this is very much a values-based judgment, not a technical one. It's like if you're a dog person or a cat person. I'm a dog person, and I can give you a very compelling argument on why I think dogs are best. My husband loves cats, and he will disagree with me. Neither of us are wrong, and neither are right. It's a values-based decision. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Jarrett and let him walk us through all the details of the decision you'll be making. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Board, for taking the time today to make to think about exactly the kinds of decision that staff can't make for you, because it is a priorities and about your definition of success for the agency. Just to review where we are in this project, we are in mid-2019, the point where we need you to tell us what your definition of success will be for the service design, so that we in turn can draw a network that matches your definition of success. That leads to developing the plan this fall, drafting the having public outreach on the network in early 2020, which puts you on track to implementation in 2021. The key questions that I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to do a presentation and then come back to these questions at the end, so we don't need to spend too much time on them. How should we balance the competing goals of ridership and coverage? And I'll ask you that question in two separate ways. One, when you're talking about the existing operating budget, and the other when you're talking about deploying potential new resources, as we have in Salt Lake County, or in the Salt Lake Business Unit at this point. Third, I will ask you, when we deploy coverage services, which are services for which ridership is not really the primary goal, what is the primary rule that should govern that, or what are the primary priorities that should govern that? And I'll come back to the details of this question. But in the large context, it's really, are we trying to meet urgent needs, for example, by serving people who don't have a lot of alternatives? Are we trying to respond to growth by serving newly developing horizontal communities on the edge? Or is it really a we pay taxes to argument, providing some service to everyone who pays into the district, which of course would cause you to spread service the thinnest of all in terms of needing to go absolutely everywhere. I want to, for the benefit of the record and for the benefit of everyone, although I know some of you have seen this before, I want to go back and really lay out the argument for why the ridership coverage trade-off is an unavoidable question and is actually the question you need to answer. I need to explain why the question is framed this way. I want you to notice that my argument for why you need to think about this question is entirely a matter of geometry. I am not here as, I'm not going to make market-based arguments. I'm not going to make economic arguments. I'm not going to make psychological arguments. I'm going to make a geometric argument. And the reason I always emphasize that is that if you can recognize when you're in the presence of a geometric argument, you can be really, really sure about it, because it's not really something that will be changed by data. So what is useful transit? First of all, one of the things we do know empirically is that high ridership transit is highly useful, and we know how to quantify usefulness. If you think about a person, a hypothetical person in a hypothetical place, who is asking, where could I be in 45 minutes? That question is more or less equivalent to, where could I work? What schools could I go to? What house of worship could I go to? What social opportunities do I have? In other words, this is a question that really boils down to, what could I do in my life? What are the options in my life? You could even say that in terms of that she is asking in some level, how free am I? Since freedom in the very essence involves having meaningful choices. So when you think about the answer to that question, the answer to that question is a blob. It's an area that she could get to in that amount of time. And inside that blob are, we can count up the places she could go. We can count up the number of jobs that she can compete for, the number of educational opportunities or shopping opportunities or whatever else. We can quantify that. These images are from our project in Dublin, Ireland. And so we can then say, a network redesign actually makes that bigger or changes it in some way. Now, I should emphasize, in some cases, it could make parts of it smaller. It doesn't necessarily always improve. But we can show the difference. We can say, for example, in our Dublin example, that the proposed network takes her to 43% more jobs, and if a business or activity is at her location, it connects them to 68% more residents in that reasonable amount of time. It turns out that expanding freedom, expanding opportunity is both a good thing to do in itself for its own reasons, but it also correlates pretty well with ridership outcomes. And that's because more than anything else about transit, transit has to be useful. And this is really capturing what it means for transit to be useful. You can think about this as that a person is going to experience in their lives, but you can also come back to a more practical scale and say, okay, how likely is it that the trip that this person has to make every day can be made on transit in a reasonable amount of time? This is also capturing that likelihood. And that really captures the sense in which, in the short run, a particular network plan is likely to make service useful to someone. And I can't emphasize too strongly that although we can talk a lot about marketing and other kinds of things, we can talk a lot about amenity, and those things are important, the primary reason that people don't use transit is that transit is objectively and measurably useless. And that as we make transit objectively and measurably more useful, that is to say, likely to be relevant to a larger number of trips that people are making, ridership goes up. Our whole experience as a firm confirms that, and the whole experience of the industry confirms that. It isn't necessarily the most exciting thing to talk about, and that's why many people want to talk about other things, but this is really the essence of it. Transit has to be useful, and if it's not useful, you're not going to attract riders. So how useful in this sense are UTA services? Now, in the course of our work, you'll see maps like these that highlight where you can get to a lot of jobs from on UTA and where you can't. Largely, this map already correlates to density, but there are some exceptions. And anyway, we'll be able to draw this sort of map for each part of the region. I'm not going to dwell on it now. It'll be more interesting when we have a different alternative to compare to. So how do you expand those blobs? How do you make it possible for more people to get to more places so they can do more things? This is pure geometry. The way you do that is to provide service that is, first of all, frequent. Frequency is the great unappreciated variable that governs transit's usefulness. And you provide a long span of service, so the service is available when it's needed. you make sure that service is designed in a coherent network where routes connect with one another so that you can go to lots of places. That's really a lot of how the blobs expand. But you only can but because all that is expensive in terms of operating cost, you have to focus it on places where lots of people will benefit. And this is why a high ridership network looks as it does and tends often to go to fewer places than other kinds of network do. And I'm going to step through this in some detail. So frequency and productivity. If you plot frequency on an x-axis, elapsed time between consecutive buses, so better frequency is to the left. It's a low number. It's a lower time between consecutive buses. And you plot productivity on the y-axis, which is boardings per service hour, the cleanest measure we have of bang for buck. You will see a curve which tends to rise on the left. That is, higher frequency tends to correlate with higher productivity. If you think about the math of that, frequency is actually in the bottom of the productivity ratio, because when you double frequency, you've doubled the quantity of service. It ought to pull that ratio down. And yet frequency is such a powerful driver of ridership that it actually pulls the ratio up. Now, this is data, this is empiricism, but I want this to be geometrically obvious. So let's understand a little bit more about why frequency does this. First of all, another piece of this data is that this is a composite of data for about 25 transit systems that we've worked in. Every time we do a project, we dump the data into this database and keep growing it. And so here you see the same pattern, which is that higher ridership correlates with higher productivity. Your network frequencies right now, in all of our maps, we're going to show you colors to represent frequency. And in our colors, red, which means extremely hot, means 15 minutes or better all day. Purple means, blue means about 30 minutes, and pale blue means 60 minutes. Now, these are the midday frequencies, because that's the state that the network is usually in, or is most commonly in, is that midday state. It also runs on weekends and a bit into the evening. I'm sorry the colors aren't clear from a distance, but I hope they're clear to you up close. In the north area, for example, the only high-frequency all-day services are inside the city of Ogden. In the central area, Salt Lake County, there is a bit of a frequent grid extending not just across Salt Lake City, but well south and well west, certainly into West Valley City. Less, of course, in the southern part of the county, and we'll talk about why. And in the south, the main highway corridor leading up to Lehigh, plus, of course, the immensely successful BRT line in Provo and Orem, are the high-frequency network. Now, I want to say a couple more things about frequency that aren't in the presentation. That's data about why frequency is tied to productivity, but let me also make it obvious to you geometrically. Frequency does three different logically independent things. First of all, it means less waiting, so a trip more likely going when you need to go. Waiting doesn't just mean waiting at the bus stop, of course. Waiting just means time spent not where you want to be. If you have to punch a time clock at 8 a.m. and the bus arrives at work at 7:02 or 8:02, you're going to wait 58 minutes at your destination. We still count that as waiting. Second, it is frequency that makes it possible for routes to connect with each other. You can draw a network map in which routes cross, but that's not like roads crossing, because the buses actually have to come reasonably soon. And that is governed by frequency. So frequency is literally the kind of glue that actually ties routes together into a network. So you can take one route and then another route and actually get to where you're going in a reasonable amount of time, which is what creates that blob. Right? Frequency is the essence of that. And then finally, of course, frequency is a backstop for reliability. A bus breaks down, another bus comes along soon. That's why this curve shouldn't surprise you, because frequency is effectively a cubed value. It does three mathematically independent cool things. And so it's the multiplication of those things that gives you that nonlinearity, that sense that once we get up to that 15-minute frequency, where people stop using a bus schedule and start trusting that the next bus will be along wherever they need it, things take off. And that's because that's the point at which the blob of access starts getting really big, because the way all those aspects of frequency work together. But frequency is expensive, so if we're planning for ridership, and I want to emphasize there's a big if clause around this whole part of the presentation, because I'm not saying you should plan for ridership. I just want it all to be clear about why, if you were planning for ridership, you would do this. Frequency is expensive, so we have to focus it on the places where the most people will find it useful. And there's some very simple geometry to that. These are purely geometric diagrams designed to make this point geometrically obvious. These two bus lines cost the same to operate because they both have two buses on them. But in the upper image, there are twice as many people within walking distance of every stop. As a result, the market is twice as large, even before you start thinking about the likelihood that each of those people will use transit. So, of course, there are more people to benefit in the upper image, which means that the overall payoff in terms of the isochrone, in terms of the blob of access, is bigger in the upper image. The blob may be the same size, but there are more people in it. There are more destinations in it. And as a result, you get more freedom out of it. You get more opportunity out of it. So that's why ridership is always higher at higher density, because there are simply more people around every stop. Density in your region is very concentrated in a few cities, which help to explain why frequency is already concentrated in those cities and why ridership is also concentrated in those cities. Walkability, okay, given that people are near a stop, can they actually walk to the stop? There are two elements of this. The image on the left shows a quarter-mile circle around a bus stop and shows shows in black the places in that circle from which you could actually walk to the bus stop in a quarter mile. And those, and as you see, if you have a reasonably connected gridded street pattern, most of the circle can actually walk to the stop in that distance. But if you have a disconnected and fragmentary street pattern with lots of sand walls and so on, then you can reduce the area around the stop that can actually walk to the stop, and that's exactly as though you had reduced the density. It has exactly the same impact as a lower density would, because it simply means that the market is smaller because some people are walled off from the market. The other important aspect of walkability is that it must be possible to cross the street at the stop. Now, obviously, when you're talking about a street like Redwood Road, this becomes an enormous limitation. If you cannot cross the street at the stop, then you can put bus stops on the two sides of the street, but you're effectively providing one-way service, because the bus will always take you from one side of the street and return you to the other. So if you can't cross the street, you do not have two-way service. And that is also a considerable barrier, which makes certain streets a less good investment than for ridership than the pure density would indicate. Finally, and so we have some crude measures of walkability that we can also apply to the region. Finally, there's linearity. All my friends in the architecture and development world understand density and walkability, but linearity is something I have to explain to them because it's unique to public transit. Here are two different ways a city could be arranged, the same four land uses. If they are all in a straight line, then one line can be a direct path between any two of them. That line is also the shortest possible route, which means we can afford the highest possible frequency within a fixed budget. If things are arranged as in the image below, where everything is back from the street or off in a cul-de-sac or off the college up on the hilltop, looking at Thanksgiving Point recently, Adobe chose to locate on a cul-de-sac at the end of a cul-de-sac so that it's impossible to drive by them on the way to anywhere else. That requires us to either run a squiggly line, which is longer and therefore we can't run it as frequently, and is also a line that is less attractive to people because it takes longer for them to make their trips. So controlling for density and walkability, even if those things are constant, linearity determines whether we have a good transit market. And if you want to understand why the historic Salt Lake grid tends to give you a better market than some of the newer development that is more, that puts major destinations on cul-de-sacs, even if you control for density and walkability. This is why. And again, it's just geometry. This is the point where I always have to say, I'm not expressing an opinion about your neighborhood or your community or your city. I'm not saying anything about the people there or the lifestyles there, or whether that's good or bad. I'm just describing geometric facts about urban layout and how those determine how efficiently transit, given what it is, can provide liberty and opportunity and thus attract ridership. So linearity, you know, an easy contrast within, well, just looking at Salt Lake, that you expect a straight line like 200 South to give us much better outcomes than a circuitous line like 11th Avenue. All of the things, even if you controlled for density and walkability, and that's in fact exactly what we find. But the bigger issue with linearity, I think, is really the suburban style employment development in particular. I use Adobe at Thanksgiving Point as just one example, where the thing is not on the way to anywhere else, and therefore I cannot string it together into a line with other destinations such that one line does many jobs. Proximity, all of the things being equal, it's going to be more expensive to cover a longer distance than a shorter distance. This is where we apologize to our friends in Tooele County. It's not that you're any less important. It's just that we have to cover a long distance to get to you, and that makes your service more important, more expensive. So that's the end of the if clause. If your goal were ridership, you would tend to focus your service on places where density, walkability, and linearity are all and proximity are all favorable. That would tend to put a lot of service in Salt Lake. In the north, it would tend to put a lot of service into Ogden and on major corridors. In the south, too, it would tend to put more service into Provo, Orem, and the major corridors. Not because those are better places, not because we politically care about those people more, but because the geometry of the patterns in which they live make them more conducive to riders. But that doesn't mean you should want that. It just means that you need to think about how much you want that, as opposed to how much you want the opposite. So here's how it plays out. In this fictional town, the dots are people or jobs. So dots close together are density. And so what you have here is about 70% of the population living along the two straight streets where things are dense, walkable, and linear. And then you have a scattering of the population everywhere else. And you hire a transit planning like myself to come in and you say, design us a transit network. And I have to say, what's your goal? I actually had this experience. I mean, I developed this methodology because I was tired of having this experience, which is I come into the town, I say, what's your goal? And they say, ridership. We have to get ridership up. So I designed this. So I put all their service on the two major streets, providing excellent service to the 70% of the population who lives there. And inevitably, their response is, but you forgot Mrs. Jones in the southeast corner. And I say, I didn't forget Mrs. Jones. You told me you wanted ridership. Now, if there is a different goal, which is getting some service to everyone, that's fine. If you want to make sure that there is service close to everyone, I will design this. So what's the difference? There are two routes, and therefore there's the minimum possible number of route miles, which means we're running the highest possible frequency. Those buses are very close together, and that high frequency expands the blobs. The blobs of access are, of course, limited to those two streets, but 70% of the city is there, and it's excellent access to that 70%, no access to the other 30%. That other 30% doesn't like it, but that's what you would do if the goal were ridership. If the goal is coverage, then that's fine. Now we have 10 routes instead of 2. We're running lots of route miles, which means we can't afford to run them very frequently, which means these buses come once an hour, whereas these buses come every 10 minutes. Since the buses come once an hour, they're unlikely to come when somebody needs a ride. Therefore, they're not very useful. The blobs of access are very small. Therefore, the ridership is very low. But that's fine as long as you didn't expect ridership from this. Because this does something else important, which is to get a little bit of service to everyone. So the thing to always remember is that spreading it, like any resource, like paint on a wall, spreading it out means spreading it thin. And when you spread it thin, you get a service that's less useful, and as a result, you tend to get less ridership. That's the unavoidable math that explains why you need to answer this question in a way that we framed it. So these goals are important, but they lead in opposite directions. And so which one you choose depends a lot on how you prioritize various fundamental public policy outcomes that are at stake here. If you want UTA to think like a business, well, a business chooses which markets it will enter based on whether it thinks it can succeed. Nobody has a right to a McDonald's near their home. McDonald's will put their stores where there are enough people. So that leads you to a ridership goal. If you're watching the bottom line of the agency, you may want higher fare revenue, which also arises from ridership. If you want to encourage dense and walkable urban development, you want a ridership goal because the ridership network, for its own reasons, will tend to concentrate service there. And finally, if you want any environmental benefits from transit, or if you want any congestion mitigation benefits from transit, all of those benefits arise only from transit being written, not just from transit existing. So all of those are exclusively tied to a ridership goal, and you would need to be pursuing a ridership goal in order to claim that you were delivering on any of those outcomes. But the coverage goal is also bound up with many things that many people like. In the coverage goal, you're thinking like a public service. Ridership responds to demand. Coverage means planning around need. And there's need everywhere. There are people who would benefit from a service everywhere. There are people whose lives will be discombobulated if they lose a service that they have everywhere. Who can be opposed to a slogan like access for all? Although, of course, access for all means spend a lot on the few people who are hardest to get to. That's always the trade-off, right? Lifeline access for everyone is a very popular idea. It often gets bound up with ideas of social justice. It often gets bound up with issues about the needs of people who have particularly severe needs. But finally, let's all be honest, it's also political geography. The coverage goal gives you service to every member city or every electoral district, whatever your political geography is, and that's often part of why coverage goals make sense. I have absolutely no opinion about this question. My job is simply to help you understand that the question is unavoidable, because the question arises from the basic geometry of what cities are and what transit is and how that works geometrically together. So your answer to this question should depend to some extent on how you're going to balance the public policy goals that are tied to each of those answers. Another thing I should say at this point is that we're going to talk about the ridership coverage goals separate for the three business units, because the amount of service inside each business unit we want to more or less hold fixed. So it'll be a separate conversation inside each unit. But I also want to emphasize, if you're thinking from the standpoint of a particular municipality, you can have the same conversation at the municipal level. Given that a particular city is going to get a particular amount of service, there's a higher ridership thing to do, which is more frequent service on the main street, whatever it is, and there's a lower ridership thing to do, which is get back into every cul-de-sac, whether it's with fixed routes or microtransit or whatever low ridership tool you're using. You're going to need to think about this on the regional scale, but I always, when I'm talking to municipalities, I'm always encouraging them to think about their point of view on a municipal scale. The same principles apply. See, here's where things stand right now, and I'm sorry this is a little busy, but I'll walk through it for you. Right now, if we analyze your current network, and it's a kind of psychoanalytic process because I'm looking at an outcome and trying to infer what the intentions must have been. In the central and southern areas, so Salt Lake, Tooele, and Utah counties, we find that about 60% of the existing service is ridership justified, by which I mean that if the only goal were ridership, that 60% of the service would still be in the same place, doing the same thing. The other 40%, if the only goal were ridership, it would not be where it is. That's what we mean by coverage service. That's the service that is essentially, whether or not this was decided consciously, it needs to be evaluated on a goal other than ridership, because if you wanted ridership, you wouldn't be doing those services in that way. Now, that's how things are in the central and southern areas. In the north, it's quite different. The northern network is, in Davis, Box Elder, and Weber, is much more leaning toward coverage. It's about 40% ridership, 60% coverage. variety of historical reasons for that, which was really no need to get into because this is about the present and the future. So we asked the public. We asked the public in 2 different fora whether they thought these balances should move or whether this was the right balance. And we gave them lots of tools for understanding that. We also did both a public outreach process and we also did a stakeholder outreach process. In a stakeholder outreach process, these are invited people. Many of them were municipal staffs, but also some other key figures in the community. We got them in rooms and in a room for 6 hours, basically, and we worked through some interactive exercises that helped them really wrap their heads around this problem so that they would give us very informed feedback from the perspective of their municipalities or points of view. So what did we hear? Here are all the efforts that were made to reach the public in addition to the community leader workshops that I talked about. What did we ask? We asked these 3 questions that we're about to ask you. Where's the right balance between ridership and coverage goals? This question has to be asked separately for existing resources as opposed to possible additional resources. The reason the questions are very different is that when you're talking about existing resources, turning the dial one way or the other is cutting somebody's service, right? Because if you're going to shift the priority toward ridership or toward coverage, that means there's going to be less of the other thing, and that's going to cause someone's service to disappear. So it's a rather freighted question for existing resources because you know you're doing that. We explained this very clearly in the survey. When we're talking about new resources, you don't have that impact, but you're still, of course, expressing a priority which determines what outcomes you should expect. Finally, we asked a second question, which is what are the principles that should govern the design of coverage service? Ridership service has a very clear goal. Coverage is actually about several different kinds of approaches, so we wanted to know about that. Here's the answer. On the left are the answers from the public and web survey. On the right are the answers from the community leader workshops. In the north area, where this is Davis, Weber, and Box Elder, where the split is currently 40-60, there was unanimity to turn it slightly in the direction of ridership, about 10 points to about 50-50. So that was I shouldn't say unanimity. This wasn't everybody's answer. This was the dominant answer. This was the median answer. But, you know, that was where the answers came out. The public was 50-50. The community leader workshops, if you had additional resources, they would have put them even more toward ridership, 60-40. So that was the answer in the north. And remember, that's in the context of the north's existing service being more tilted toward coverage now. The central area where the current split is 60-40, this is Salt Lake County, the answer was basically keep it where it is. That was the public's answer. The community leader's answer was shift it further toward ridership from 60-40 to 70-30. Again, 60-40 is the status quo there. So the community leaders would have turned it further toward ridership. When we normalize central area responses by zip code, we get 50-50, which is a slight turn toward ridership. What I mean toward coverage, I'm sorry, a slight turn toward coverage. What I mean by normalizing by zip code is that 60-40 is the answer if we weigh every vote equally. If, on the other hand, we factor each response according to the population of the zip code that it comes from, so that zip codes that gave us lots of responses have less weight per response, and zip codes that gave fewer responses have more weight per response, we get a more coverage-oriented answer. That is exactly what you should expect, because as always with transit surveys, people who use transit more respond in greater numbers, and so we get greater numbers out of the inner Salt Lake zip codes than we get from the south. So when we weight them, we put more weight on the answers from lower density areas, and of course they prefer coverage more because that gives them more service. Exactly the same thing happened in the south. Comfortable with the existing split on existing resources, so really no stomach for cutting anyone's service, and actually a lean further toward coverage in the case of new resources. you understand that in the context of the South, which has a network that is very, very heavily focused, that is not at all expanding into all of the areas that are growing horizontally.
Can I ask a question in regards to the coverage? And if you're covering this later on, that'd be great. Is coverage assumed that it's the same time period of operation? Or is there a coverage scenario where you're covering, fairly broad in the morning and fairly broad in the evening?
Right.
And looking at that.
This question doesn't really get down to that altitude. This question is really more how much of the budget should be devoted to coverage services in general. It's not actually designing those services and making those decisions yet.
Okay.
That'll be the next. That will come though.
All right. Thank you.
Then you remember we asked this question about coverage priorities. So to the extent that we are planning for coverage rather than ridership, what principle should guide us in designing that service? We built this around the three most common answers to that question that I've heard every time I've done this, which is, one, service for people with no transportation alternative. There we tend to visualize seniors, people with disabilities, people who can't drive for whatever reason, and also often some very low-income people. Prioritizing that would mean that when you have your coverage resources, you wouldn't spread them over every town. You'd be focusing on the places where those kinds of people are more concentrated. The second common reason is service responding to growth or new development. Now remember, this is horizontal growth. Vertical growth tends to correlate with ridership as long as it's built in a walkable place and linear place. Or the sort of where's mine question. I pay taxes to, spreading service out to all taxpayers. The responses on this are quite decisive. There's a strong tendency to rank those three things 1, 2, 3 overall in the sequence I described them, and that coverage service should first of all be oriented toward people who have no transportation alternative. Now, there are small exceptions to that. In the North, the community leader workshops were a little more interested in new development than the public was. And that's understandable when you think that many of these community leaders are municipal staffs and people who are involved in development in one way or another. But we only got that outcome in the North, Davis, Weaver, Box Elder. In the South, when we did not weigh by zip code, we got a little more lean into growth or new development. But when we normalized by zip code, that went away. This has to do with the fact that in the South, unusually, we got large numbers of responses from relatively low-density areas, so that normalizing by zip code flips the answer around the other way. That just has to do with who responded and the fact that there was a lot of interest in the survey from places like Eagle Mountain, Saratoga Springs, that don't have much service now. So what would it look like to change the balance of service? What would that mean on the ground? So I'll just show you pictures of this. If here is the North, Davis, Weaver, Box Elder, and red is generally the area that would have more service if you turned the dial toward ridership, and blue is the area that would have less service as you turn the dial toward ridership. Why are these what they are? Density, walkability, linearity, and proximity, those four purely geometric variables about urban form. Nothing to do with our opinions of the people involved. It's just urban form. Those principles applied to the geography of the North would tend to cause network to focus on, first of all, the linear path that has lots of people along it, which is the single highway, not I-15, of course, but the highway next to it, which goes through the centers of lots of cities and has lots of development on it, but is also linear. Secondarily, local service inside the city of Ogden, which is the one place that's dense enough to generate a demand for a local network. I can't emphasize too strongly how powerful universities are also in creating those markets. And finally, Bountiful, more as a matter of proximity, that because Bountiful is so close to Salt Lake, we have so much more market from Bountiful into Salt Lake, and therefore there's the ability to support more service going in than you have over longer distances. That's the principle of proximity at work. When we look at Salt Lake County,
I want wanted to ask a quick question, and this might be way too theoretical, but if you juxtapose the southern portion, so the Utah County version, it's similar in its linearity, is my own estimate, in the sense that it goes around a lake. It only has a couple of major access points, but yet the difference in the ridership versus coverage, is it because of growth that is established as a difference between the two, or was there because there was limited access when these bus routes were established, that it just kind of kept going that way? Does that make sense? Or is that community driven, or that might be hard to tell?
This is a history question, so I'm not the right person.
A little bit, I know.
I think one of the major reasons that we see more coverage service in the northern area than we do in the south is we have a lot of express routes. And so Provo and Orem are fairly large economic centers, a little bit larger than Ogden. And we see more long express commuting trips down to Salt Lake City from the Ogden area than you do from Provo north.
So this is what it looks like for Salt Lake County. And note again, there are a bunch of different things operating here, not just density and walkability. Sometimes, one of these overwhelms the other. So you do see places where the walkability is pretty terrible, but the demand is high enough that a ridership network would still try to do something. Not just the city of Salt Lake, but also tendrils reaching well down into Sandy and Draper. And also well west. Most of West Valley City is inside what a high ridership network would do. Again, notice that you may think of West Valley City as associated with low income, but its geography is sufficiently favorable that you'd go there for a ridership reason, not just a coverage reason. Blue tending to be the places we would go to just for coverage reasons. Please notice that the light rail system isn't really part of this analysis. So I'm not saying that that light rail shouldn't go to the airport. I'm just saying that from the roles of coverage of bus service, not much bus service would go there. And Tooele County, of course, would also be entirely a coverage area because of its low density and large distance. Going to the south, you see, again, much as in the north, Provo and Orem being large enough and dense enough to support local high-frequency transit networks. Otherwise, again, the linear path going up to Lehigh. But other than that, other areas being primarily coverage areas. This is the areas colored in on this map are mostly areas that are served now. But if you extend your look further on out at other areas that you might cover, I can assure you that those would all be coverage areas. Nothing like Provo or Orem is being built now out there. If somebody came and built another Orem or Provo, then of course that would be a ridership area, but that's not what's being built. Now, people always ask me this question: what have other agencies done with this question? And this is like being back in high school, and wondering if our peers are doing better than us in some way. So I preface this question by saying this decision should be about your region and your values for your region, and I discourage you from being too intimidated by or too influenced by what other cities in different situations have decided. But here are a few examples. I can talk you through a few of these numbers. We prefer to use only examples that my firm has worked on because we understand them thoroughly and can explain them. But 5 of the projects that I've worked on recently: Houston, Columbus, Fresno, San Jose, where your new general manager is from, and Richmond, Virginia. Fresno and San Jose haven't been implemented yet, but we do have the policy outcomes. There are the existing splits on the left. Now, in these splits, I want to mention that we also broke out a third category, which is duplication. Services running right on top of other services, not doing that well, really neither ridership nor coverage. And the easiest services to decide to label as waste, if you want to do that. And you'll notice in all cases we took that out. But in general, there are certainly examples of very, very strong decisions to turn the dial toward ridership. The most extreme is Houston. I took them through this process, and the Metro Board, without any new money to spend, turned the dial from 55% ridership to 80% ridership. That caused, some of that was paid for by eliminating duplication, but there were definitely coverage losses. And you look at where the coverage was lost, and density, walkability, and linearity always explain it. You know, it was very much a geometric rather than a cultural or decision. Ridership is up 3% there, but it's 3% against the background of a lot of contextual decline. It's the only Texas agency where ridership is rising, many others are falling. Columbus made basically reallocated its duplication, but otherwise did not change the split. They just moved their duplication service into coverage. Their initial existing network was very inefficient, and so we got some ridership growth without turning the dial very much. Fresno was already 85-15 and turned the dial slightly to 90-10. San Jose was 70-30, and through a couple of steps, they've now adopted a plan that's basically 90-10, and it will be implemented this year. Interesting conversations there where elected officials representing low-density suburban areas took differing positions on this, and a couple of them took very high-profile positions saying, we need an effective transit system, and an effective transit system doesn't serve me. And so there are interesting trade-offs like that came up about how individual leaders balanced what would be, you know, the expectations of their constituents with sort of the math of what would make a good system for the region. Richmond, Virginia, 50-50, turned it to 70-30. That's also in the context of a BRT system having been implemented at the same time, but the network redesign expanded access enormously. The old system was very inefficient. It's up 17%, one of the biggest success stories in the U.S. in ridership terms. So there is a general tendency for North American transit agencies right now to be turning the dial toward ridership. Has to do with where ridership has been trending and a feeling, of urgency about that. But I'm not saying anything about what you should do. That's them, you're you. So questions for the board. My first question is, and it's really a question from staff, is there any other information that would help you make this decision? I've laid it out geometrically. I've laid out some information about the survey responses, and there's a whole lot more detail from the survey that you are welcome to delve into, which is available. But the first question is this, and I guess maybe let me step through all the questions and then let's have a discussion.
Just so you know, you have a little bit of a cheat sheet in front of you, this 11 by 17. It summarizes the engagement results, and then also on the right side lays out the 9 decisions that you'll need to make.
So the ridership coverage question, which is separate for the 3 business units, gives you the current ridership coverage split for each business unit, and then it asks you, do you want to shift the split or leave it where it is? If you want to shift it, where do you want to shift it to? And it asks you this separately for existing resources and future service growth. Now, cautioning, only when it comes to future service growth, this is hypothetical in the context of the northern and southern business units. Only in Salt Lake County is there the actual money to grow service. So in the context of the Salt Lake business unit, that second question is not hypothetical. But we would still like to get direction on this so that staff has a sense of what to do as situations arise. And so those questions are there for the 3 business units. Then we have this question about coverage priorities. And here we're asking you again, for the service whose goal is coverage, do you want us to respond to need, disadvantage of some kind? Do you want us to respond to serving new horizontal communities, or do you want us to respond to providing some service to everyone who pays taxes? And I've given you the survey's answer to that question. I want to make a few more remarks at this point, just to put this in context. There is no staff. It is important that there is no staff recommendation, because this is a value judgment about competing priorities, and it is to great extent a question of what your expectations will be and how you will define success as you look at the performance of the agency going into the future. If your definition of success is ridership, turn the dial toward ridership. If not, understand as you look at performance in the future that the performance of services is going to depend on what their purposes are, which is perfectly understandable. And if the purpose of a service is coverage, and you know that it's a coverage service, and by the way, when we do the network plan, we'll document that. We'll document exactly which are the ridership services and which are the coverage services. And you should have appropriately low ridership expectations for the coverage services. It's not their purpose. So this is really a question of your definition of success for the agency in these terms. So next steps, for us to keep the project on schedule, we would really like your answer to this question by the end of July. If it slides further than that, we're likely to have schedule impacts. Then we will this fall get together, and in case you're curious how this happens, my team comes here, me and some analysts who work with me, and we lock ourselves in a room with a bunch of your experts, and we have big maps and colored pens, and we have lots and lots of conversations, and we figure it out together. So I'm not going to draw your network up back in my own ivory tower. It's going to happen here, working with your staff, with the goal that everybody understands why whatever we came up with looks as it does. That goes through the typical outreach process. But one of the things to remember about this outreach process, though, is that we will be referring back to this moment. And we will be saying very clearly as we present the network, this looks as it does because of the direction the board gave us in July. Right, so you will see the impact of this decision in the network. If you tell us to turn the dial toward ridership, you'll see coverage disappear in the proposed network and ridership services here, and you'll see how that grows the average level of access to opportunity, although obviously it's not great for the people on the route you deleted.
I think part of that decision process is also to refer back to the original outreach and how your decision is based on the outreach from the community and our community stakeholders.
Right.
So it's this process of we heard you from March to April when we did the surveys and we did the stakeholder. The board made their decision on how we're going to do this balance. Now look, this is what that means, right? And then we'll come back to the advisory board and the board with our 5-year mobility plan again to get the reactions, and the board can make the tweaks to make sure that this is what we heard, this is a ridership or the balance that we've changed or tweaked. And it's to continue that dialogue with the public of educating them on how we make our decisions with service and how the board is reacting to their feedback and conversation. So I think in this outreach and engagement process, as I'm trying to outline it with our staff, is to make sure we keep giving them feedback of how we've used their information to us and how the board's making their decisions through this long process of service.
Thank you, Nicole. As somebody who's been doing this kind of study for a long time in a lot of cities, let me also assure you, when the plan comes out, to the extent that it changes anything, you're going to have controversy. Controversy itself is not evidence of a problem in this business. The media will want to make it one, but controversy is actually a completely normal part of this process to the extent that you actually propose to change anything. And the more you change, particularly if you tell us to turn the dial in a way that will add service someplace and delete service someplace else, the more controversy there will be. Controversy itself isn't evidence of failure. And that's important to understand from the beginning as you go into this. However, lots of people will have strong reactions when they see a map, any map. However, the value of this when people do see the map is that we want at least you and key opinion leaders who were in our community workshops, and by the way, your local advisory board, whom I will be speaking with about this afternoon, to not be surprised, because they will remember how this follows from the conversation that happened in the summer. It is important, by the way, that I'll be taking the local advisory board through the same presentation this afternoon, and in hopes that you will have some advice from them by the time you come to make this decision. That's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions or have any discussion.
And I couldn't get to a decision by the end of July, but I guess the real question is if you can get me some answers to some questions that I have. I was thinking about this in the context of an airline schedule. You only go to Casper maybe once or twice a day, but you can get to Casper, right, if you go through Salt Lake. And so, and if you're from Casper, it's an important flight, or if you have to go to Casper, it's an important flight. And so that's why I asked the question about, and I'm sure we have boardings. I don't know, do we have boardings by hour of boarding or exiting of the buses?
We do. We collect a lot of data. We look at productivity rates, so passengers per hour for all of our routes, and I have all of that data for us. And we have some service performance standards, but again, I just want to reiterate Jared's point that the performance metric is different for a ridership-focused route
Sure.
than a coverage route, and so.
But where I'm going with it is that if coverage sort of in this equal society means everybody gets coverage through the whole day. And there may be some value choices as we look at coverage where you say, we'll give you coverage, but it's, from 6 in the morning till 10 o'clock and maybe 3 o'clock until early evening. And then, whether it's microtransit or something that you utilize for special needs or, individuals like the elderly who probably are going to be better served by that other solution as well. And, and then looking at frequency on sort of main trunk lines and maybe even main trunk lines in the communities. I remember visiting with a local official in the southwest part of the valley in Salt Lake Valley, and he said, well, if you had to consolidate your bus lanes, here's the route we would prefer that you went on, and that, this is where we're going to put our density. This is where we would rather have, 15 or worst case scenario, 30-minute intervals, and it connected between two systems, and you're probably also probably going to attract folks that, where transportation is a factor of their living spot, and who may not want to be in the Salt Lake, proper area, but, needs that kind of transportation connection into some of our mainline systems. And so maybe there's this third option, and because I think sort of to break it down just simply between coverage or frequency doesn't quite cut it for me. And so I guess I want to know how we get there.
Yes, please.
Let me explain how I think your consideration fits into what I'm describing. If you were to tell us to turn the dial away, you can look at your current schedules and see how much service you operate now in coverage areas. A lot of it's probably a bus once an hour all day. Some of it's probably peak only, as you described. If you turn the dial toward ridership, the first thing we would do is do the kind of analysis you're describing. We'll do that at the technical level. And we may recommend that rather than deleting all service to a place, we turn back the service hours, exactly as you suggested. Run fewer trips. That's the sort of thing we would consider in response to your direction. We're asking a higher altitude question, which is, do you want to turn that dial at all? And if you do, understanding that if you do turn that dial, cover it with existing resources, coverage areas will experience some service reduction that people will yell at you about. Even if it is not the loss of all service, it may be the trips disappearing at the time that some particular person needs them. So I would argue that this is what you're describing is very much describing one of the ways we can manifest a decision of yours to turn down the commitment to coverage if you were to make that decision. That's one of the things we would look at.
Yeah, I guess the only sort of, and it's a slight pushback, I would say, is you may, on the coverage scenario, say it doesn't make any sense to, for example, and I'm just using this as an example, to drive a Flix bus around and picking up 80 passengers a day. And maybe this goes to the frequency assertion, but if you have one key route or two key routes through that community, and you double that service, and it's not necessarily cutting back on existing, and then you figure out sort of this other time of day thing or a different kind of scenario. The problem with just saying more ridership versus coverage is that the general public aren't going to go through your technical analysis.
I think there's a messaging piece that you're
I
talking
get
about.
that you get there.
Right. I think there's a messaging piece in there. I think there's two things we can talk about. One, to Jarrett's point, if you were to say, let's turn the dial a little bit to ridership, how do we plan the service where we're moving the dial? And Laura's going to talk about some of the suggestions, like how we're doing microtransit, how we would do frequent networks within that municipality. So there may be one ride, one line in down their corridor that's linear and has the productivity that would run frequent, but we've eliminated all those flex routes with the microtransit. So she'll talk about that. But I also think how we message what that really means is when the lines get on the map. And so just saying it's ridership or coverage seems pretty black and white in a sense that really it's talking about where the balance of it is. And if we take it down to each municipality, it changes. So if we look at Salt Lake City, they're doing a frequent networks a system. It's frequency, but they still have trips to transit for way up on the foothills and way in the airport. So I think the team will be working depending on your leverage of the 10%. We're thinking real high on this decision matrix, but then the team's going to take it down to come bring you back and say, it still costs us a lot of money to cover that municipality with that frequent network. And that's what coverage is more resources going there and less ridership for those resources. So I think we can have that balance of a conversation depending where you lean, so it's not as black and white as what I'm hearing from you, Chair.
Yeah, I just would like, as we make the decision, that I think we can avoid some of the ambiguity that comes in sort of a ridership versus coverage thing if we just talk about how could this be more effectively. I mean, just sort of shooting from the hip, if I was going to put new money, it would be heavily focused toward ridership. I mean, you look at some of the declining numbers and those kind of things. You'd want to think that through a little bit as we went through the upcoming change days, and you looked at some routes and sort of how they're winding around, and you'd have to say to yourself, that's not only bad coverage, it's not really getting where we want to. I mean, they're easy pickings of the fruit, and I think you have maybe some non-traditional kinds of mixtures of schedules, and sort of the historic schedules of yesteryear. People are far more sophisticated in how they're looking at it. You went in on a high frequency route, you do want to walk out on 2nd South, just get on the next bus. But if you're in one of these communities, I think they're sophisticated enough that they're not going to walk, out the end of the cul-de-sac and then expect something there. But if they, had certain windows, 80% of them probably go in those 3 hours in the morning or, 3 hours in the evening. And you probably satisfy the overall coverage piece. And there's probably components where their cities are developing where you'd want to say, let's put this resource, or whether it's new or reapportioned into frequency, and at the end of the day, they're probably better served than they were today.
Those are all things that we, in response to your decision, we will be able to study in more detail and come back to you with specific recommendations on.
Sorry, I dominated.
No, you're just fine. You showed one slide where you indicated there were, I think, 5 different cities that had made some changes, starting with that one with Houston, I believe. That one right there. it seemed to me that all of them made changes to ridership versus coverage.
All of them turned the dial
to ridership.
All of them, except Columbus, increased their investment in ridership service. Yes.
Right.
But
so here's my question. Do you have any information about what happened in terms of overall revenues to the system as a result of that?
Higher ridership means higher revenue, but the details are very specific to each agency in terms of how their fares are constructed. In all of these cases, I should emphasize that there was a measurable increase in total completed trips, not just boardings, and your fare revenue will tend to track with total completed trips.
Right.
Yeah. So you would. I'm not going to get into the details of revenue because each agency's revenue structure is so different. But higher ridership means higher revenue.
Okay. How about the perception in terms of the public after the change was made? Is there any indication as to how the public responded?
Well, it depends on what you mean. The ridership change is itself a public reaction, right? It's in fact, if your goal is ridership, ridership is actually the best measure of the public reaction that matters.
You keep referring to ridership, but maybe they turned the dial to ridership, and that was the emphasis.
Right.
But did the actual number of boardings go up?
Yes. Yes. The actual ridership went up.
In each of these cases?
Yeah, that's what the rightmost column here is.
Okay.
The actual increase in ridership.
Yeah, but that's marginal given the fact that Houston went from 55% to 80% and they get a 3% ridership change. That's marginal increase.
That's in the context of significant economic decline in Houston. The period of really 2015 to 2017, the period of historically low gas prices, not only have gas prices depressed transit ridership generally by making driving cheaper, but it had a particular effect on Houston because of the petroleum-based economy.
Sure.
So there was a big loss of jobs in Houston in 2016-17. So this is 3% above a trend line going down.
Okay. All right. Now, were any of these cities supported by tax revenue?
Well, these
similar to the way we are with the sales tax.
All
revenue?
transit systems are supported by tax revenue.
Then my question is, do we have any information about the receptivity of the public to voting in favor of tax increases or additional tax increments as a result of this change from focus towards ridership? Do we have any information that says in the next time that there was a tax question on the ballot, it was overwhelmingly approved or rejected or something like that to show not just the ridership, but the perception that we're meeting the need, and so people are voting for additional taxes to provide this kind of additional ridership? Do we have any kind of information like that?
I can speak anecdotally, and maybe Alex can speak to this because he was working in Columbus when this took place. But I can speak. I spoke with Carolyn about when this happened in San Jose.
In San Jose.
And the whole reason why they did the outreach and did this look at ridership was to really deal with perception, because I hear your conversation about the public and the public perception. And it was led by one of their board members who really wanted to dive into their services and was getting public feedback that their buses were empty, why were they empty, and really understanding the agency's decision-making on coverage versus ridership. And so they went through this process the board requested it, to really think about what are the policy decisions choices for the agency. So Carolyn kind of walked me through why they did that as an agency, and it was partly to really talk about the perception and how they can move with the community moving forward of choosing ridership over coverage. And that's why they came to that place, was to build that trust and have the community say, yes, this is where we like to be. We understand ridership as a choice over coverage. And why our bus is empty? Because, you know, we were doing a coverage. These routes were for coverage. They're not going to be as full as a dense bus. And so I think you see people looking at those ridership pieces and having these kind of outreach programs to work with their public about what the choices are for our board, for our agency, and how we move forward with service distinctions. I'm not sure about taxing and bonding, but I know that was the perception key. Would you like to hear from Alex?
Yeah, I went through this process in Columbus prior to coming here, and we actually had a renewal tax levy that went through at the time, right through the middle of this process, and it passed overwhelmingly. And I think a lot of it was the public input that we were doing something to modernize our bus network, to fix things. And we are a little bit of a different situation here than when we're in Central Ohio, and even then in Houston, because we in Central Ohio, part of the impetus had been we had not restructured our network significantly. It had changed organically over time since the early 70s. In Salt Lake, in the Wasatch Front, we did a restructure of our network in, I think, 2007. So a lot of those things kinks got worked out. But part of the ridership increase that we saw in Columbus was taking service that just existed because it happened over time and thought about the whole network more holistically. And I would say for Houston, which I was down and involved with them during their launch, we went down and talked with them. Part of what makes their increase significant is, in addition to, as Jared pointed out, the economic downturn, the nationwide trend, both their trend locally, they had double-digit losses in ridership year over year prior to this. They had also had system-wide across the country, Houston was one of the only agencies in the country that saw an increase in ridership at all, while other systems were losing ridership after this change. They saw an increase, and the same happened in Columbus. So,
thank you very much.
I'd just like to add one thing, which is when it comes to asking the voters for new money, what we've learned unquestionably is that you need to ask in presidential elections. And this runs counter to the media narrative we've heard. One of the things, you've probably all heard about the failure in Nashville. There are a number of other prominent failures which tend to get lots of media attention. The reason they get media attention is that they were special elections so the media could focus on them. In 2016 was practically a nationwide clean sweep of transit funding measures. But you didn't hear about it because the media was talking about the rest of the election. So what we know everywhere now is that presidential elections are the time to ask the public this question because you get the highest turnout, and that the success rate is really starting to be very good on these measures when asked at those times.
I had a question. One thing I wanted to tell you is in California, they have a cap and trade revenue model, so it's not directly tied to that. But the second thing I wanted to ask you is when you look at Richmond, Virginia, they had the 50-50 originally, so they had a pretty balanced approach, if you could say that. And they obviously chose to redial it to the ridership model. What impact did that have in that community, in the sense that, so in our North business unit, we have it opposite. It's higher in the coverage model. So anything that you do to increase ridership, I think, could increase your numbers, but did that ultimately serve them? And I guess in tangent to that, understanding if the economic centers, like you mentioned the Provo-Orem model as to why that was structured in Utah County, does economic development and growth have any impact that you're aware of?
Let me talk, in answer to your question about Richmond, Richmond is much more compact, and as a result, losses of coverage mostly meant longer walking distances. This area is so much geographically larger that losses of coverage probably mean no service. They probably mean you're going to have to drive, you're going to have to get a ride. You're going to have to carpool. We need to emphasize, too, part of the whole context of this is there are a whole bunch of other transportation options out there, and turning the dial toward ridership means, in part, you're not going to try and do it all. You're going to try and do the thing you're good at and, encourage lots of other things to happen. The relationship with economic development is generally that there's a really strong positive relationship with economic development that happens in urban forms, and that there is a very problematic relationship with economic development that happens in the form of the sprawling suburban business park. One of the interesting things that we were dealing with in Columbus and that we also had to deal with in Cleveland, and that I think is coming up with some of the development plans I see here for employment, is that, you were telling us at breakfast about, a proposed major employer that wants to locate at Eagle Mountain, but that thinks that a lot of their employees will come from West Jordan. That is to say that lots of people are going to have to travel enormous distances. That is a large-scale transportation problem that will manifest either as congestion, will manifest primarily as congestion because it's a difficult market for transit to be relevant in. The likely solution is probably carpooling. But those are, so again, I just have to come back to that. Urban design is urban form is the overwhelming determinant about whether transit is really relevant at all to those kinds of problems.
If I could add just one little comment, I know we need to wrap up, but given the fact that the community responses were to sort of maintain status quo with the existing resources and make modest adjustments, I think we can take that as a compliment that our service planners have done a good job and that the service is largely doing what the community thinks that it needs to do. So I just want to leave you with that I feel like this is really validating for our team's work and the work that we've done in the past, that we're really generally meeting the needs. And so these are modest shifts, much more so than you see these other communities took.
Steve?
Yeah, just a couple questions. When you looked at your table for the UTA, you didn't talk about duplication. Mm-hmm. Did you see much?
I want to support Laura's comment that you don't have a lot of duplication here compared to a lot of the agencies I've worked with, certainly Houston or Columbus. And that has a downside, which means that if you don't turn this dial, if you choose not to turn the dial, we can't just unpack huge resources by reallocating waste. You have to have somewhat lower expectations for how much of that we can do, because there really isn't a lot of waste.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then do you see these on-demand services, the innovative mobility strategies that we look like, does that help change the equation on coverage?
Has no effect on this question. Okay. You have to that's a very vague term, innovative mobility. For our purposes, we have to immediately divide it into two categories, things that involve paid drivers and things that don't. Everything that doesn't involve paid drivers is a wonderful win-win for you. Encourage the scooters parking at the stations and all that stuff. That's great. As soon as you're talking about the public sector paying drivers, you're talking about something that is part of this mix and competes with whatever else you would do for funding. And there's no question that demand responsive operations of all kinds are coverage services only and become part of the toolbox once you have already told us how much coverage you want.
Okay. One more question is that, we have these developed areas and you show those and how they match coverage versus ridership right now. For some of these communities that want to aspire towards creating something that transit can support, what's your strategy, your thoughts on strategy to move forward to encourage that? You say, well, they may be in a coverage area now. Is that identified in those new resources?
We will provide you, when we get to the later phase of the study, we will provide you with some basic recommendations on how to encourage that. Okay. The primary tool we'll recommend is working with the cities, as Salt Lake City has already done, to develop policy frequent networks that say, essentially, these streets have the sufficiently dense walkable and linear right? They already have enough of the favorable geography that if things were to continue to develop in that way, they would come to support frequent service. That's ultimately a policy you should develop together with each municipality, because it's ultimately their planning and their street design, that makes it a success or not.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you. We look forward to having an ongoing conversation and remind folks to return at 1 o'clock for the advisory council and further discussion on this important topic. Just a reminder that we have no meeting next week, and our next meeting will be on July the 31st. With that, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So move.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We stand adjourned.